Beijing, one of the 10 largest cities in the world and a hub of business and culture, home to most of China's largest companies, and with more billionaires living there than any city in the world, it's one of Earth's greatest metropolitan centers. But below the city, there's another city with over 1 million people living in conditions that couldn't be further from the surface. Welcome to the underground bunker metropolis of Beijing. It all started in the Cold War, as many things did. China was a powerful nuclear-armed nation in the 1960s, but its role in the geopolitical conflict was dwarfed by that of the rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Many in China were worried that the tensions between these two powerhouses would boil over into nuclear war, as it almost did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Chinese leader Mao Zedong was determined to do something about it. He ordered major Chinese cities to begin the process of building bomb shelters that could withstand a nuclear bomb. Beijing in particular went to work. After all, how many bomb shelters is too many for a city? How about 10,000? The city was ready for the inevitable, but the inevitable never came. Nuclear war never happened, and the tensions rose and fell as the Cold War eventually ended with a whimper rather than a bang in the 1980s. But as the Soviet Union faded and eventually collapsed, China's economy was growing, and more people from the outside world were starting to look at the country as the next big world power. All of a sudden, China's vast network of underground bunkers started to look like a necessity, and for some enterprising businessmen, they looked like an opportunity. Today, Beijing is a thriving city of over 21 million people. During the day, they all mill around the surface going about their day for work, school, and recreation. But the city's housing market is highly competitive and rates are high, and many people can't afford even the smallest apartment. So as night falls, roughly 5% of the city's population simply disappears from the city's surface, going to find their home in a very unconventional place. They're about to enter Beijing's secret underground city. In the 1980s, as tensions ebbed and China's leadership turned their eyes to the economy, many of these underground bunkers were leased by the Defense Department to private landlords who converted them into low-cost apartments. They're mostly used by migrant workers and students who are far from home, seeking a low-cost place to live. There's just one problem. Housing laws in China are strict, and living underground has been illegal since 2008. That hasn't stopped many people from seeking refuge underground, as the government is rarely able to police the massive network of underground bunkers. So, what is it actually like to live in a Cold War bunker? The bunkers are far from view and kept very secretive, so it's not easy to find out. In fact, it may be hard to even see where one's located. They can be found through unobtrusive entrances in standard buildings, and it's common for them to be guarded by security. But stories of this vast network of underground residents spread around the world, and one Italian photographer was determined to uncover the truth. His name was Antonio Facciolongo, and he was ready to enter China to find the truth. It wouldn't be easy. The bunkers were everywhere in the city, but entirely out of reach of an outsider. Facciolongo searched the city, but everywhere he went, they seemed to be blocked off by security guards who sent him away brusquely. It was clear he wouldn't be able to get in by asking, so he submitted a formal request with the government, which was promptly denied. Breaking into government facilities in China can be a risky move, but he had come so far. So he cased one bunker and waited for the guards to take a lunch break. He was in, and what he found inside was a whole other world. While laws in Beijing require a minimum living space of 43 square feet per tenant, the underground living spaces are often shockingly small. The bunkers were built with the basic amenities needed for extended survival, including electricity, plumbing, and a waste disposal system. But livable doesn't mean comfortable, and living deep underground doesn't lend itself to great air. The underground city is poorly ventilated, and the air can be filled with mold spores, which can lead to health issues for residents. So it's basically a small apartment, but underground? Not exactly. Most apartments at least have their own bathroom. The bunkers were designed to get as many people into a small space for emergency living after a nuclear strike, so comfort wasn't a forefront concern. Shared bathrooms and kitchens can often have long waits, but it's better than living on the streets. But what about the private living quarters? As Facciolongo explored the underground bunkers of Beijing, he found many of the residents were secretive. Many refused to speak to him or let him enter their quarters, and those who did were hesitant to be photographed. Of course, this made sense as the apartments were illegal, although the laws are poorly enforced. But many more didn't want their faces to become public because they were embarrassed of where they lived. Many had told their families that they had full apartments on the surface. Facciolongo found an apartment that contained a man, his mother, and the man's 2 small children under 4 years old. The floor space was so small that the bed, for all 4 residents, nearly covered the entire surface. And it wasn't a place for quiet contemplation either. The larger space next door was used as a parking space for motorcycles, with people coming and going frequently. There was one thing going for these apartments: cost. Small living spaces means small rent, and these tiny units could be had for as little as $40 a month for a family living space, while larger rooms that could house communal groups of 10 could cost only $20. That made these underground cities a less than ideal but effective choice for people in need of somewhere to live. And it's certainly appealing when looking at the rents on the surface, with the average apartment going for at least $1,500 a month in US dollars. And for those living in the underground, the strange new life becomes normal. While living spaces are close, the residents don't keep to themselves. It's common to see members of dozens of different families mixing in the common area of the bunker. The smells of cooking fill the air, conversations and televisions can be heard in the background. For those who venture outside their apartments, they can find a second family among the many people in similar situations in the underground. And while the living quarters aren't comfortable, they're usually safe and kept clean by the residents. But what brings people to this underground? The vast majority of residents of the underground cities, often called Beijing's Rat Tribe after an article by a Chinese photographer, Sim Chi-yin, are young. A mix of students and workers who have come to Beijing to try to make their fortune. They view the underground city as a transition stage in their lives, hoping to get a higher paying job and save money while living there. They plan to be out of their current situations and into a high-rise Beijing apartment within a few years, and many have well-paying jobs while living there. But for others, the reality is very different. As the cost of living in Beijing increased, the salaries didn't always increase with them. Many people with stable jobs ranging from waitresses to tech workers found themselves slowly priced out of their surface-level apartments as the real estate market skyrocketed. Unable to pay their rent and facing homelessness, they were forced to downsize to a bunker apartment, living alongside the many short-term residents. But even in underground cities, there are often two worlds. Many of these more stable, older residents can afford slightly larger living spaces, and it's not unusual to find their bunkers neatly decorated and looking more like a studio apartment. And the increase of residents from all classes has led to a surprising transformation. The underground bunkers often have unused rooms, and some bunkers don't have residents at all. These spaces often get converted by residents or outside groups into community centers, with Fascia Lungo traveling the network of bunkers and finding entertainment facilities hosting billiard tables and karaoke machines, along with dining rooms and even schools where people learn the ancient art of calligraphy. And that has led people in Beijing and elsewhere realizing something about their cities. There is a lot of space underground. While not all cities have the massive underground network of bomb shelters that Beijing and other Chinese cities do, many have significant tunnel networks used for other purposes. The most common underground networks are used for subways. While most people just pass through quickly to get to their train, many cities are outfitting their most popular subway stations with a collection of stores and restaurants, hoping to get people to stick around a little before or after their commute. And while underground areas may not be the most colorful, they do have another major appeal. In many cities, it can get very hot in the summer and freezing in the winter. That can put a major damper on tourism if people have to be outside. Chicago, notorious for its bitterly cold winters, created the Chicago Pedway, a network of 4 underground tunnel systems covering more than 10 blocks. These not only connect the most popular tourist attractions in the city without people having to walk the streets, but they're full of businesses that make them into something like a massive underground mall. There are tunnels everywhere, even in the happiest place on earth. If you've ever gone to Disney World, did you wonder why you never saw anything unusual that didn't fit with the theme of the park? You never see staff outside of costume or character. You never see any first aid stands or security guards. And that's because Disney theme parks have a network of tunnels underneath them, allowing the cast members to come in without being seen by guests, and allowing the park's massive security network to operate in complete secrecy, all in the name of preserving the magic for guests. Of course, it's not a surprise that one of the most secure places on Earth would have an underground tunnel system to match. The United States Capitol Complex, holding the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Library of Congress, is at the heart of Washington, D.C. Holding hundreds of the most important people in the country, the building is open to the public, but the massive network of tunnels and underground walkways underneath are not. They allow the representatives and staffers to head between buildings easily, as well as providing an easy escape route in an emergency. And for those representatives who may have held their seat for a very long time, the underground network even has several small trains that can transport them to their destination. For many cities, as urban development gets more hard to fit into crowded cities, the future involves looking down. But for the residents of the underground cities of Beijing, things are still uncertain. Huka'u, the Chinese housing system that's been in effect since the Cultural Revolution, is considered outdated and ties the support the person gets from the government to their living situation. That means that China's fast-growing economy means many new arrivals and even long-term workers need to find unconventional living opportunities. And the legacy of the Cold War buried deep below the urban center is always welcoming new arrivals to its unusual city beneath the city. Machine guns, bombs, and snipers blasting you to pieces. Chemical weapons that make you vomit up the lining of your throat while you suffocate. U-boats full of scorching heat and rampaging cockroach colonies. While later history would unfortunately prove that World War I wasn't the war to end all wars, it's still remembered as one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. On one side, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, lost an estimated 4 million soldiers. On the other side, the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, and America lost about 6 million. The civilian death toll, meanwhile, was by some estimates as high as 13 million. All in all, the total death toll of the First World War reached approximately 15 to 22 million people. That's more than the entire population of Los Angeles, tragically wiped out over the space of 4 years. While artillery shelling, chemical warfare, and aerial strikes were responsible for their fair share of deaths, many of these deaths were caused by diseases spread by the squalid conditions of trench warfare. All of this is a roundabout way of saying that you probably could not survive a day in World War I. To go into the gory details, and believe us, they are indeed gory, about why, let's start with the most obvious way that you'd be likely to die in the First World War: the weapons. The early 20th century saw huge technological advances in all aspects of life, and warfare was no exception. Even before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which officially started the conflict, smaller territorial conflicts like the Boer War and the Italo-Turkish War, as well as a decade-long Cold War between England and Germany, encouraged the development of never-before-seen methods of destroying the enemy. Let's first look at the machine gun, a vital weapon for infantry combat in the First World War. The first fully functional self-powered machine gun was invented in 1884 by Sir Hiram Maxim. In contrast to the Gatling gun, the Maxim was much lighter, and instead of being hand-powered, it was automatically reloaded using the recoil of the previous bullet it fired. It's no surprise that the Maxim was an instant hit, and by the start of World War I, manufacturers on both sides of the conflict were making gun designs using technology pioneered by the Maxim. Early machine guns were mounted on tripods or wheels and would be operated by soldiers in fortified turrets along the trench lines. These were cumbersome beasts, but what they lacked in portability they made up for in sheer destructive power. The Maxim could fire 600 rounds a minute, with the British-made counterpart, the Vickers machine gun, able to fire 500 rounds a minute. If you, as a soldier, somehow managed to avoid being turned into Swiss cheese by a machine gun turret, you would still need to avoid enemy snipers. Rifles were the most common weapon on the battlefield in the First World War. By 1903, most armies had adopted a new type of rifle with a manually operated locking mechanism and a magazine that allowed soldiers to load 3 and 10 bullets into the rifle before needing to reload. The rifles used in the First World War had a far higher rate of fire than any other guns available to the average infantryman in previous conflicts, with an experienced shooter being able to fire up to 15 rounds a minute. They also used a new type of gunpowder, nitrocellulose or smokeless powder. The lack of visible smoke meant snipers could fire with better visibility and were less likely to give away their position, which made them deadly in long-range combat. It's said that while no battle in the war was decided by riflemen, no battle could have been fought without them. Backing up the turrets and snipers were the artillery. These guns were mounted on wheels and required whole teams of men to operate. Varied in size, but were all incredibly deadly thanks to their high rate of fire and the adoption of high explosive shells. Strategies varied between light and heavy artillery, most of them involving the word barrage. Box barrage, Chinese barrage, creeping barrage, you get the idea. Artillery was mainly used for support and defense, as it was the most reliable way to take out large numbers of troops at once. Artillery was also used to damage defensive structures, and using heavy artillery, explosives could be fired from deep behind the front lines into enemy trenches. But the by far scariest new weapons to debut in the First World War were chemical weapons. Even though the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions both categorized the use of asphyxiating gas on the battlefield as a war crime, it didn't stop them from being widely used on both sides. The main purpose of chemical weapons was to incapacitate and kill defensive troops inside trenches. In the early days of the war, chemical weapons contained tear-inducing irritants in such small amounts that they basically amounted to pepper spray. At the time, it was thought to be under the threshold of what the Hague Treaty counted as a gas attack. But after people noticed that these weaker gases weren't that effective, both the Germans and the Brits started to really ramp up their use of chemical bombs. Starting in 1915, the first to be used was chlorine, a deadly gas that causes tissue damage to the throat and lungs and can lead to death by asphyxiation. After being hit with multiple chlorine bombs at the Battle of Ypres, the British retaliated by creating their own chemical weapons program. This was considered a cowardly but necessary move, as the stalemate was so bad that the British were willing to try anything to gain a foothold in German territory. Early tests weren't successful, however. In the Battle of Loos, an attempt to hit the Germans with chlorine backfired when the wind suddenly changed direction and blew the chlorine back toward the British trench lines. Other chlorine canisters didn't release their payload upon impact and were actually saved by the German troops to be thrown back at the British later. As the war went on and technology was refined, even more deadly gases were introduced into the mix. There was phosgene, which, while colorless and less strong-smelling than chlorine, took 24 hours to fully poison its victims. This meant that while phosgene had a higher fatality rate than chlorine, its victims were still able to fight for hours after being exposed to the deadly gas. Phosgene was typically mixed with chlorine to a deadly cocktail called White Star, which was responsible for 85% of deaths from chemical weapons in the war. Then, 1917 saw the introduction of mustard gas. Despite the name, it was actually more of a spray that was released from artillery shells and settled on surfaces as an oily liquid. While not nearly as deadly as chlorine or phosgene, contact with mustard gas was very effective in incapacitating enemy soldiers, as exposure to it caused vomiting, irritation of mucous membranes, painful blisters, and in severe cases, internal bleeding. The worst thing about mustard gas was that once deployed, it would soak into the soil, where it could remain active for days or even months, depending on weather conditions. If you were an average soldier on the Western Front, that is to say fighting in Western Germany, France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, you would most likely be fighting from trenches. A trench was normally about 6 feet deep and 3.5 wide, and was reinforced with barbed wire, sandbags, wooden planks, and sheet metal. This might seem like a less than ideal place to house your troops in a battle, but there's a pretty clear reason why trenches were the way to go. During the early battles of World War I, offensive technology was advancing much faster than the technology needed to move troops from place to place. The tank wouldn't be invented until the war was almost over, so the transport of troops was still mainly limited to trains and horses. In short, you had a lot of people fighting in big open spaces with extremely deadly weapons and no reliable way to get away. So both the Central Powers and the Allies started digging trenches to provide cover for their frontline troops. Trench warfare really came into its own in the race to the sea, when both sides unsuccessfully tried to block each other off before their troops could reach the Belgian coastline. By the end of 1914, both sides had uninterrupted lines of trenches stretching from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. By that point, the Western Front was locked in a stalemate. Traditional maneuvers were impossible without suffering massive amounts of casualties. If either army tried to send troops across no man's land into enemy territory, they'd be obliterated. This was especially true for Allied troops, since the Germans had been able to secure the higher ground early in the conflict. A typical day of trench warfare went something like this. Troops would take 4-day shifts on the firing line, and afterwards take shifts in the support position in the trenches. If you were on the front line, you and your comrades would try to move toward enemy territory. You would be spaced widely apart to make it harder for the enemy to take you all out at once, and you would have to move in a zigzag to make yourself a harder target. Soldiers on the front line were in constant danger of being sniped, gunned down, or blown up by artillery bombardment. Even if you weren't directly hit by an artillery shell, the shock waves created by the explosions were powerful enough to give you a concussion, and there was always the risk of catching a piece of shrapnel in one of your vital organs. If you weren't in the firing line and stayed behind in the trenches, you still had to keep your guard up. Other than the risk posed by constant heavy-duty artillery barrages, both sides also had snipers placed at strategic locations, waiting to shoot anyone they saw emerge from the top of the enemy trench. One Allied soldier described an experience that proves just how quick and deadly the German snipers were. During the afternoon, a chap looked over where the trench was shallow and said, "Look, I can see the German line." But that was the last thing he saw. He slumped down in the trench, shot through the brain. If you were in their line of sight for even a second, you had a high chance of meeting your end via German bullet. Most of the time, you couldn't even go out to use the latrine. The bombardment usually slowed down at night as the gunners and snipers lost visibility, but that didn't mean you were completely safe. With nightfall came the risk of trench raiders. Using the darkness for cover, teams of raiders would sneak across no man's land with their faces darkened with soot for camouflage. Depending on the orders from the top, sometimes they only raided a trench to gather intel or steal sensitive documents. Other times they just dropped live grenades into dugouts where enemy troops were sleeping, or worse, pumped the trenches full of poison gas. Even if you could avoid getting hit in a trench raid, you had a second, more insidious enemy down in the trenches. The elements. In some ways, the trenches of the Western Front were preferable to the Asian and North African battlefields, as soldiers on the Western Front could take advantage in lulls in enemy bombardment to visit nearby towns and stock up on supplies. In 1916, France experienced its rainiest autumn in over 30 years, which dashed any positive opinions anybody might have had on the Western Front. Since much of their plant life around the battlefields would have been long destroyed by bombs and artillery shelling, the upturned soil of no man's land quickly turned into an impassable muddy marsh. The trenches themselves were extremely susceptible to flooding, and there was no reliable way to drain the water out. This also made the trenches a breeding ground for disease. That's what happens when you have a bunch of men sleeping in the mud together within spitting distance of a bunch of dead bodies. Rats were a constant problem, as were lice, and bites from both facilitated the spread of a nasty condition called the trench fever. Trench fever wasn't fatal, but it was extremely infectious, with a long incubation period and a high rate of reinfection in those who already had it. The amount of stagnant, muddy water in the trenches didn't help things either. It made injured soldiers susceptible to infections, and standing around in all that water led to developing trench foot. Trench foot, which was also known as jungle rot in Vietnam, is a type of severe tissue damage caused by having body parts submerged in water for extended periods of time. It's very similar to frostbite, only wetter and about 1,000 times more gross. In extreme cases, the tissue would become so rotten and infected that sufferers would need to have the infected foot amputated completely. If the Western Front sounds a little grim for you, maybe you'd rather take your chances in one of the other theaters of war. After all, you only ever seem to hear about the Western Front, so the other fronts must not have been as bad, right? Unfortunately, that is not the case, as the battles on the Eastern Front were just as deadly, if not more so. The conflict on the Eastern Front was fought mainly between Austria and Russia. Now, Russia was already not doing so well when the war broke out, though the Allies put their faith in Russia's superior manpower to defend the Eastern Front. The truth was that Russia was the least technologically advanced of the great European powers. They didn't have nearly enough infrastructure or manufacturing capabilities to transport and arm their troops as quickly as Germany or the Ottomans did. Though the Russians were able to gather an army of 5 million, they didn't have nearly enough rifles for everyone. Their military was woefully underfunded and suffered from poorly organized leadership. Tsar Nicholas, Russia's supreme emperor, had way more institutional power than he did military know-how, leading to the Tsar and his top commanders often butting heads over strategy. This clash of personalities meant the Russian soldiers were slow to receive orders. On top of that, their allies in France and Britain struggled to send them supplies due to, of all things, differences in the way Russian train tracks were laid. In pretty much every other country, the tracks were laid with 4 foot 8 inches of space between them. But in Russia, they have an even 5 feet between them. That might not seem like a lot, but it is enough to cause serious delays in transporting rations, medical supplies, ammunition, men, or basically anything between Russia and the rest of Europe. That was bad news for Russia, since their army was hemorrhaging troops left and right, and they really needed support. Russia lost 5% of its male population over the course of the war, which is a similar percentage to England, but considering how much bigger Russia was, it added up to a staggering loss figure. The losses got so bad that in the later stages of the war, Russia started enlisting women as well, in an effort to boost national morale. As bad as soldiers had it, prisoners of war on the Eastern Front had it worse. Germans and Austrians captured behind enemy lines were forced to build canals and railroads and were subject to malnutrition, scurvy, and exhaustion due to food shortages. Malaria was also extremely common in the summer months. When the German and Austrian governments caught wind of these horrific conditions, they complained to the Russians, who refused to acknowledge the complaints at first. As with a lot of problems in Russia, the poor treatment of POWs was mostly down to dwindling resources and bureaucratic infighting. It's really no wonder that these guys had a huge revolution toward the end of the war. The Eastern Front battles took place over much more widespread areas, with more space for troops to maneuver, so trenches weren't as common as they were in the West. You might be tempted to think that the less crowded, less wet living spaces meant that diseases was less of an issue on the Eastern Front, but you'd be wrong. Disease was actually worse on the Eastern Front, with malaria, cholera, dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses accounting for around 4 times the number of deaths that were caused by actual combat. This is because while the battles of the Western Front mainly took place in wide-open fields, a lot more fighting on the Eastern Front took place in major cities of Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and other countries bordering or within the Russian Empire. Soldiers on the Eastern Front came in closer contact with civilians, meaning they had more opportunities to catch diseases, which would then spread from city to city as refugees fled from the carnage in large numbers. The deaths by disease got so bad that the German army started a large-scale sanitation program in every city they occupied. They quarantined neighborhoods with high rates of disease, started mandatory lice checks at military bathhouses, and even established sanitation police to inspect the cleanliness of homes and businesses. So the fighting was brutal no matter which front you were on. But that's just the army. What did naval battles look like in World War I? Two major players in the naval conflict of World War I were Britain and Germany, who had been in a naval arms race for over a decade before the war broke out. The main type of battleship that dominated naval warfare in the early days of the war was the dreadnought. British dreadnoughts were well armed but deliberately lacked armor in order to increase speed. The idea was that they'd be faster than any ship that was bigger than them and better armed than any ship that was smaller. German dreadnoughts, in contrast, were slower but far more damage resistant. However, neither type of dreadnought was especially well equipped to deal with attacks from torpedo boats. Submarines began to see use around this time as well, but they were imprecise with limited range and were more effective at taking out supply ships than surface warships. That being said, German U-boats did manage to take out a few smaller British ships. The Navy had it a bit easier than the Army on both sides, as they saw comparatively little combat. But even when they weren't engaged in battle, conditions were less than ideal. One account from a German naval officer in 1914 describes life on a U-boat as incredibly claustrophobic. The batteries which powered the sub's electricity were kept dangerously close to the ventilation intake, and whenever the men wanted to load a torpedo into the tube, all the furniture had to be moved out of the commanding officer's quarters to make room for it. It was so bad that some men on the sub started taking opium on longer missions just to help them keep their cool. On the other side of the war, British commander Arthur Bond's account of life on the HMS Swan describes the experience as being akin to living in an oven. Meat would spoil easily, ice melted immediately, and all the drinking water was warm. Other officers on similar battleships described cockroach infestation and a pervasive layer of grime and soot over everything due to most of the British ships still using coal power at this period of time. Another big danger for those serving in the Navy was underwater mines. These were mainly placed along coastlines in order to stop boats from getting close enough to conduct coastal bombardments or complete supply runs. The first battleship sunk during the war, the HMS Audacious, was sunk by a naval mine on October 27, 1914. In addition to the Navy and the Army, World War I saw the introduction of a new element to warfare: aerial attacks. The first people to make use of airships for war were the Italians, back in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911. During Italy's assault on Libya, Zeppelins were used to bomb Turkish positions, marking the first ever use of aerial bombardment in history. 4 years later, in 1915, the Germans used Zeppelins to bomb both military and civilian targets in London and Paris. Thankfully, the casualties were minimal, but later air raids would become more destructive. One of the worst raids was one that occurred in 1915, when a single German Zeppelin killed 22 people and extensively damaged surrounding buildings. Zeppelins were highly effective in stealth raids as they made very little noise, but they were also slow and full of highly explosive hydrogen gas, two facts that made them easy targets for anti-aircraft shelling. Even outside of battles, the war caused thousands of indirect casualties in countries that were nowhere near either front and really weren't all that involved in the war. Food shortages hit hard during the war years, and as this was the age of colonialism, imperial forces fighting the wars would make up for these food shortages by redirecting supplies from their colonies. In British-controlled East Africa, conscription of farm labor led to a famine in 1917. And German soldiers in Africa frequently stole cattle from African civilians. African men were also recruited as carriers for the colonial armies. By 1917, 1 million African subjects from the colonies had been conscripted by the British, and as many as 95,000 had died. Exact numbers of African civilian deaths are hard to get, as they were considered less important than European deaths. One colonial office bureaucrat summed up the attitude of the time pretty succinctly when he wrote, "Who cares about the native carriers?" Even after the war was over, its effects were felt for decades after. Troops returning from the front brought the deadly Spanish flu pandemic with them, which killed even more people in the coming years. Russia's Tsar was overthrown by a population who saw his poor management of the First War as the final straw. Germany's economy and infrastructure were gutted by the Versailles Treaty, leading to civil unrest that then paved the way for the Nazi Party to gain power. Parts of Europe were rendered barren for decades afterwards by shelling and chemical bombs. Even the people who survived were fundamentally changed in a way that soldiers in previous wars had not been. So if you think you could survive all that, well, we admire your confidence and will send flowers to your relatives. Stand to, soldier! You thought that the trenches, mud, barbed wire, and chemical weapons of the First World War were bad? Well, fall in and squaddle up, because you're in for a whole other world of hurt. That's right, we're back for a sequel, World War II. And this time, it's still war, but it'll be a whole lot deadlier. First things first, this isn't your granddaddy's World War. Times have changed, and both tactics and weaponry have evolved quite a bit since the days of the Great War. From the devious new tactics and dangerous amounts of firepower that enemy forces are bringing to bear, to the innumerable threats from air, land, and sea. Here's why you wouldn't last 24 hours on the front lines of the Second World War. Now move out! While World War I was largely fought in the trenches, the second major globe-spanning conflict saw enlisted soldiers facing warfare on entirely different terrains and engaging their enemies on the land, in the air, and at sea, as well as the most horrifying style of warfare of them all, math, throughout the use of cryptography and secret ciphers. But let's start with some boots on the ground. With the land battle, also it's probably important to point out, we're talking about the threats the Allied forces faced. If you're under any delusions that you would have been fighting for the other side, well then this isn't the video or the website for you. With that out of the way, let's drop you right in the thick of it. An Allied soldier in the midst of the most deadly conflict in history. No, really. With 17% of men in Allied uniforms ultimately meeting an untimely end, you'd be lucky to make it to the end of lunchtime. Never mind seeing out the war until 1945. Overall, an estimated 70 to 85 million people were killed over the course of the Second World War. That was around 3% of the entire global population, estimated to be at 2.3 billion people in 1940. Even speaking purely statistically, you'd be considered lucky to see out the week, but that's enough math. Let's take a look at some of what you'd be up against fighting against the forces of Nazi Germany. Over the course of World War II, the Nazis employed a military tactic known as blitzkrieg. While you might more commonly associate that word with planes dropping bombs during air raids, that was only one part of a larger strategy. Roughly translated to lightning war, blitzkrieg was all about using the elements of speed and surprise to strike at your enemies. And that includes you, Private. You're up against an opposing force whose sole objective is to break through your army's lines as quickly as possible, using coordinated maneuvers and concentrated attacks involving armored vehicles and airstrikes, followed up by the Nazis' ground troops. Let's break down the blitzkrieg strategy first so you know roughly what you'd have to expect as a soldier on the receiving end of it. Then we'll follow up by going through some of the Nazis' more infamous weapons. After all, you're not going to make it through the war in one piece. You might as well know something about what your cause of death will likely be. As we mentioned, the first step of the blitzkrieg involved a lot of armored and motorized vehicles, which would be used to initiate swift, powerful attacks that, while only brief, would focus on breaking through your lines of defense. Assuming you weren't instantly killed by being caught in a barrage of tank shells and separated from your extremities, then you'd next be under the raining hellfire of an air raid. The second part of the blitzkrieg used swift aerial attacks to catch opposing troops off guard, likely while they were still reeling from the aforementioned armored vehicle attack. Before you've even had a chance to pick up you or your comrade's severed limbs, your ears still ringing from the bombing of tank shells, you look up to see a swastika-emblazoned bomb plummeting out of the sky directly toward you, as the Nazis take advantage of the element of surprise. Thirdly, blitzkrieg would see ground forces deployed, meaning if you by some miracle lived through the tank attack and the subsequent air raid, then several angry Nazis would soon be sweeping in the area to shoot any survivors on sight. You see, attacking in multiple different ways was intended to confuse the enemy's troops, making it harder to respond with a counterattack when the methods the Nazis were using were constantly changing. So unless you've been supplied with good intel on how the enemy is about to attack, you'd likely need a serious hand. Well, an entire arm, actually. Keep looking, we're sure it fell off somewhere around here. Of course, blitzkrieg wasn't all enacted as part of one singular attack, but on a much wider coordinated scale. Sending in tanks and planes and infantry, all one after another, would be a hell of a frivolous use of military resources. The point was, the blitzkrieg would constantly change up the battlefront the war was fought on, targeting weaker points in the Allies' defenses with one main point of attack. And then as their opposing forces mobilized to protect that weak point, the Nazis would break through and begin targeting another. All with the ultimate goal of Vernichtungsschlacht, or total annihilation, wiping out literally all of the Allied forces in order to secure a unilateral Nazi victory. Nazi forces first employed the tactics of blitzkrieg during their invasion of Poland in 1939. Within a year, their army had used the same tactics to mount multiple further invasions across Europe, including against France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And through these very same tactics, Nazi Germany was able to defeat France, Denmark, Norway, and Luxembourg, as well as kill 380,000 soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force that were stationed in France, all by 1941. At the same time, from the perspective of soldiers on the ground, they were up against an opposing army that seemed impossible to defeat, ferocious in their tactics, and unwavering and unquestioning in their loyalty to Hitler and his fascist ideology. Now, as we pointed out earlier, and as you've likely noticed, this is drastically different from how the preceding First World War was fought. And on the part of your opposition, the Nazis, that difference was very much intentional. You see, the doctrine of Blitzkrieg and Vernichtungsschlacht, the swift and brutal attacks and utter devastation of the enemy, were strategic ideals that emerged between the wake of World War I in 1918 and the start of World War II in 1939. The First World War was a war of attrition, fought in an ongoing near stalemate, as one side's forces in the trenches fought the other side's forces, also holed up in their own trenches, effectively in a race to the bottom being whoever ran out of resources first. That's not just food and ammo either. When we say resources, we mean troops like you. That's right, as far as the generals are concerned, you are a resource too, and an expendable one at that. With advancements in tactics, the Nazis also brought improved weaponry to bear in the Second World War too, and the numerous progressions in the field of weapons technology between 1918 and 1939 meant that you, down in the front lines fighting back the Nazis, would be looking down the barrels of some pretty mean guns. Throughout the Second World War, bolt-action and machine guns were among some of the most prominent weapons you'd be facing off against. But whereas, say for example, the rifles back in 1914 would fire 15 whole rounds per minute, some of these new improved weapons were capable of firing 400 rounds per minute at ranges of up to 6,000 feet. That's a lot more bullets whizzing through the air, enough to give you an unexpected new lead-based facial piercing or a handy new permanent sleep aid by having a shot fired right through your brain. So let's take a closer look at the Nazis' arsenal, the guns that would in all likelihood prevent you from lasting very long on the front lines. The Karabiner 98K, sometimes shortened to the Kar 98K, was the standard issue weapon for most Nazi infantry. Designed by Mauser, a German arms manufacturer that had been producing weapons for the armed forces of Germany as early as the 1970s, the Karabiner 98K was the latest in the long line of bolt-action rifles and semi-automatic pistols that Mauser was famed for creating. An earlier variant of the Karabiner actually saw plenty of use during the First World War, with the updated modified 98K version being commonplace throughout World War II as well. The K, if you're wondering, wasn't shorthand for 1,000. It actually stood for Kurz, the German word for short. So, the Karabiner 98K was the standard issue rifle you'd likely be on the business end of when facing off against Nazi infantry. Now, the overconfidence in you might have you thinking that because rifles like this need their operator to lift and pull back a bolt to load in their next round, that might give you ample time to move out of the path of the next shot. Maybe in the second it takes for a Nazi soldier to chamber his next round, you could dolphin dive out of the way or dash to a better position to take retaliatory shots at him instead. But this isn't Call of Duty, kids. While bolt-action rifles like the Karabiner 98K were only capable of firing single cartridges at a time, that's not to say the Nazis weren't also packing fully automatic firing weapons too. You see, by around 1940, the Wehrmacht, that's the armed forces of Nazi Germany, realized they would need something with a higher rate of fire to improve their infantry's effectiveness in combat. Once they had submitted the specifications for this new breed of rifle, there were two competing designs for an automatic rifle, called the Gewehr 41 or G41, made by different manufacturers. The first, the Gewehr 41W, was made by Walther, the same manufacturer of James Bond's iconic PPK pistol. And the second of those automatic rifles, the Gewehr 41M, was designed and created by our old friends Mauser. Each had the goal of their weapons being distributed among the Wehrmacht troops during the remainder of the war, with both rifles submitted for trials in 1941. Do you even need to guess whose design the Nazis favored? Winning out over Walther was the Mauser version of the Gewehr 41. It was heavy, clunky, and unreliable, even though it was made to resemble the Karabiner 98K in an effort to make operating the rifle familiar to the Wehrmacht troops. The results seen after the initial use of the G41M among the troops on the Eastern Front were considered, well, less than satisfactory. Of the over 6,600 rifles manufactured before production was halted, more than 1,600 were returned and deemed unusable. But don't think that means you'd be safe from automatic gunfire. Given that the theater of warfare had changed since the trenches of World War I, infantry in the Second World War didn't need long-range bolt-action rifles except for certain specialists like snipers. Instead, because this war was being fought on a far different playing field, the ways in which soldiers used their weapons and what they required of these weapons also changed. Instead of shooting at an enemy dugout 2,000 yards away, closer-range combat meant that newer guns only needed an effective range of around 400 yards, with a less powerful cartridge. Stop us when you see where we're going with this. While the kind of fully automatic rifles you worryingly might see at your local Walmart was still a little way off from development, there was another breed of rapid-firing weapon that you would not want to be on the receiving end of. Meet the Humble Submachine Gun, or SMG, if you're one of the people who get tetchy about things like that. By far the most common, and we're sure some would even argue iconic, of the Nazis' World War II submachine guns was the MP40, widely distributed among the Axis powers and equipped with a 32-round magazine. Between 1940 and the end of the war in 1945, an estimated 1.1 million of these weapons were produced, and they even became a favorite of soldiers in various parts of the world long after the Second World War was over. The MP40, or Maschinenpistole 40, has even seen limited use in conflicts as recent as the Iraq War and the Syrian Civil War. This is all thanks to upwards of 200,000 of these guns being recovered and redistributed by the Allies after World War II, given to paramilitary and irregular forces of developing countries. They were used heavily by Nazi infantry troops, as well as by the paratroopers and armored vehicle crews all across the Eastern and Western fronts. And as for you and your fellow Allied soldiers, well, you can't even correctly identify this weapon, as the MP40 was erroneously referred to as the Schmeisser by the Allies after weapons designer Hugo Schmeisser. While he was responsible for designing the MP18, the first ever mass-produced submachine gun, Hugo Schmeisser had nothing to do with designing the MP40, which was designed by Heinrich Vollmer and inspired by its predecessor, the MP38. MP38s were highly similar to the subsequent MP40s in appearance and functionality, so both saw widespread distribution and usage among various parts of the Wehrmacht. They wouldn't be the only guns spraying lead at you in rapid succession on the front lines either. Erfurter Maschinenfabrik, or ERMA, who produced the MP40, also created a German copy of the British Sten gun, known as the MP3008, and other improved variants of existing SMGs would hit the battlefield before the war was over. Another similar submachine gun design emerged after being developed in 1943, hence its name, the MP43. While it might have fired less powerful cartridges, the weapon had a lighter recoil and it would have been easier to handle. However, fighting on the front lines, you could have almost escaped certain death at the hands of a Nazi wielding an MP43, if the Führer himself had been successful in trying to get the weapon's development halted. That's right, Adolf Hitler didn't want this gun to hit the battlefield. But don't worry, he wasn't fussed about it being unfair to Allied troops like you. No, instead he was pushing for an entirely different weapon. You see, Hitler had previously fought in the First World War, assigned to work as a courier delivering messages from leaders to the troops on the Western Front. It was probably this familiarity with how that war was fought that made him feel like his soldiers still needed weapons that could fire at longer ranges, like the 2,000-yard capable bolt-action rifles that were more widely in service back during the Great War. So when plans for the MP43 initially crossed his desk, the Führer gave his order to cease the wider production of the weapon, and instead, the focus should be on the development of something more long-range. And this is where it gets interesting, and why you would still have to worry about being on the wrong end of an MP43. The arms minister of Germany at the time actually went behind Hitler's back and approved the production of the MP43. The name was changed to include Maschinenpistole, the German word for machine pistol, since this was the widely used term for submachine guns. Hitler hated it. But with this one simple trick, the arms minister managed to get 3 separate factories producing MP43s, and Wehrmacht troops all across the Eastern Front were now clamoring to get their hands on these hot new guns. Hitler would have stayed none the wiser had the MP43 cover not been blown by some divisional commanders, who asked the Führer when they could expect shipments of these new weapons. Naturally, as he often was, Hitler was furious and ordered a full-blown investigation into what had happened. Luckily for the arms minister and the weapons factory workers who had disobeyed Hitler, his investigation revealed that the new and improved MP43 was so effective that the Führer changed changed his mind about them. Going forward, the weapon would be designated under a different name, the Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle. Yep, we lied before. The Nazis are part of the reason why we have assault rifles in the modern day. And this really doesn't bode well for your chances at survival, does it? The MP-43, now known as the Sturmgewehr 44, often shorted to STG-44, made history as the world's first successful assault rifle. It was more compact than the longer, larger bolt-action rifles that had seen battle throughout the First and Second World Wars, capable of a higher rate of controllable automatic fire, and would even go on to influence another famed weapon 2 years after World War II ended, the Soviet AK-47. So yes, the German granddaddy of a gun so famous it's still actively used across the world is one of the many Nazi weapons pointing at you. Basically, if you've somehow managed to last a few hours on the front, we wouldn't fancy your chances once the STG-44 starts spraying, since they were widely regarded as efficient, functional, and lethal. When it comes down to being turned into Swiss cheese by bolt-action rifle fire, submachine gun fire, or assault rifle fire, the choice is a hard one to really feel 100% confident about. But then there are the big guns. Oh yeah, we're not even close to being done describing just how many ways the Nazis had of shooting you to death. Luckily, when it comes to machine guns, they'd only settled on 2 options, the Maschinengewehr 34 and the Maschinengewehr 42. While both were produced until the end of the war, the MG42 was developed to replace the MG34, which was more expensive and took longer to make. The MG42 became the standard general-purpose machine gun for the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. This led to the MG42 being used to provide suppressing fire for Nazi troops against their enemies, and it even earned it the nickname of Hitler's buzzsaw, thanks in part to the sound it made, but also because it would cut down anything that stood in its path, you included. The MG42 was so reliable and easy to maintain that it eventually influenced the standard design for NATO light machine guns after World War II, particularly the United States Army's M60 machine gun, a favorite of the US Navy SEALs. The modern German Army continues to use a modernized version of the MG42 as their standard light machine gun, and if the longevity of this design tells you anything, it's that you really don't want to find yourself standing downrange at one of those things. Okay, you've disregarded all of our advice so far, you fool you. But maybe if you keep your head down, crawl around on your stomach in the mud, and try to avoid the bullets firing at you from all these dangerous newly developed guns, then maybe you might see the end of the week. Except while you're down there, you might want to watch your step, as one wrong move could see you very quickly obliterated in a variety of fun and gruesome ways. Let's talk about mines in a segment that we like to call How to Avoid Ending Up in Several Different Places All at Once. Among the assortment of anti-personnel mines that the Nazis used was one referred to as a pot mine. When stepped on, a vial containing acid would be crushed, and this would ignite a primer, which would then detonate the main charge, killing whoever was unlucky enough not to watch their step. Another was the S-mine or shrapnel mine. These were buried underground with several wires sticking out of the surface, waiting to be stepped on by an unsuspecting Allied soldier. Upon triggering a shrapnel mine, you'd see exactly why it got its name, or you would if you weren't in all likelihood killed. Once tripped, an S-mine would launch into the air and explode, scattering several high-velocity steel balls in every direction, which would become embedded in anyone not mortally wounded by the initial blast. Now we know what you're thinking. I'll just hide away inside a tank safely surrounded by all that armor. Well, nice try, but unless you've been enlisted in the relevant vehicle division of whichever Allied army you're a part of, then you wouldn't be able to just hop in the tank. And if you were somehow able to get in one, that still wouldn't protect you from death by landmine. Case in point, the Nazis had a whole host of anti-tank mines, the standard version being known as the Tellermine, containing an entire pound of TNT. This large, flat, circular mine, imagine the shape of a dinner plate, would commonly come with a centrally mounted detonator charge, which was screwed into the mine's base charge. When a weight of at least 350 pounds drove over it, in this case the tank you so ingeniously thought you could take cover inside, the Tellermine would detonate with enough force to tear the treads off any tank. Next up was the Holz mine, or the wooden mine. Oh yeah, you thought it was just dangerous metal objects to keep a lookout for. The goal behind the Holz mine was to avoid being noticed by the Allies' metal-detecting minesweepers. It consisted of a wooden box with 10 pounds of TNT inside that required around 250 pounds of pressure to ignite and detonate. Then there was the Riegel mine, a long, narrow rectangular-shaped device fitted with just short of 9 pounds worth of amytal explosive. These were particularly deadly because they had not one, not two, but 3 detonation methods. Multiple igniters, one on top and 2 on either side, were wired together and would respond to different amounts of pressure, either 440 pounds on either end or a whopping 880 directly on top. By far the most ingenious and terrifying of the Nazis' mines was the Goliath, a mine that consisted of a small vehicle like a remote-controlled car. All those Call of Duty Black Ops fans out there, think of the RCXD. A Goliath was powered by a small electric or petrol motor and controlled via a wire that its driver could use to steer it toward a target. And these remote-controlled mines could cause a fair amount of damage too, thanks to their payload of 200 pounds worth of TNT. Oh, and if you somehow managed to steer clear of all those mines while hunkering down inside that tank, there'd still be a barrage of Nazi anti-tank guns to deal with. Take the Pak-38, the standard infantry anti-tank weapon used throughout the war by the Wehrmacht, and it could punch 50mm shell-sized holes in tank armor. Later, anti-tank weapons developed by the Nazis, like the SPZ B-41, were so devastatingly powerful in their performance that after capturing one, the British were forced to speed up the development of their own anti-tank guns in order to keep up with the Nazis' engineering. Okay, so maybe being down on the ground amongst all those bullets and explosives would just mean an unfair disadvantage when it comes to your continued survival. Add to that just how difficult the battlefields made treating wounded infantry or getting them to safety. Typically, when an infantryman, like you for example, got injured in combat, a company medic would have to cautiously crawl toward their fallen comrade, at which point they'd then have to assess your injuries, see how severely you'd been hit, and figure out what to do with you, if there was anything they could do. Depending on the extent of the wound, a field medic would then have to quickly begin treatment, normally applying dressings and tourniquets to stop any bleeding, and then coating your wounds in sulfonamide, an antibiotic powder, to minimize the risk of infection. But if you found yourself bleeding out from a gunshot wound in an area that was under heavy fire from the Nazis, then a company medic would have a hard time reaching you safely without being injured or killed themselves. And of course, the longer you're lying there in excruciating pain, the more likely you'd be to develop a serious infection or catch another, more fatal bullet wound. If you were lucky enough to be treated by a combat medic, then a litter team of 4 fellow troops would be summoned from a nearby forward aid station, usually contacted over a portable radio or field telephone once the medic had managed to give you some first aid. Then the litter team would rush out and grab you and bring you back to an aid tent, sometimes protected by other soldiers. But once again, if you were under heavy fire and difficult to get to, this would make it tricky for the litter team to get to you and carry you to safety. So, given all the threats on the ground and the low probability of surviving them, maybe you want to take to the skies or sail the seas instead, perhaps thinking that you'd be able to survive 24 hours in World War II on a different front. Well, old sport, you'd be wrong. Being part of an Allied Navy or Air Force was just as deadly as life among the infantry. Kamikaze tactics, a strategy adopted by Japanese forces fighting against America, saw numerous aviators enacting ramming missions by flying their planes directly into enemy ships. This idea began at the attack on Pearl Harbor, when a Japanese airman, First Lieutenant Fusata Aida, deliberately crashed his heavily damaged plane into the United States Naval Air Station in Kaneohe. From there, kamikaze attacks started to be intentionally deployed in 1944 during the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, wherein 24 Japanese pilots launched attacks like these against a U.S. escort carrier. It resulted in one of the deadliest naval battles in history, with 34 ships being destroyed and over 5,000 crew members being killed by these kamikaze pilots. Some kamikaze planes were even provided with extra gasoline tanks and fitted with bombs in order to make them even deadlier when they crashed. In Okinawa, around 5,000 United States Navy personnel were killed in the course of a single battle thanks to kamikaze pilots. Over the entire course of the war, 47 ships were sunk as a result of kamikaze attacks, causing over 10,000 casualties. As if terror raining down from above wasn't enough to contend with, the Allied forces at sea also had the looming threat of Nazi submarines, or U-boats. They employed a tactic known as Rudeltaktik, or the Wolfpack tactic, when it came to launching attacks on convoys of ships sailing side by side with battleships escorting them. These Wolfpacks consisted of between 8 and as many as 20 U-boats who would conduct an organized attack on an enemy convoy under the leadership of a shadower, the designated submarine that would signal the others to launch the attack. Given the sheer number of U-boats used in these attacks, with submarines coming from all angles, the Wolfpack tactic was incredibly difficult for the Allied forces to defend their ships against. It also didn't help that the technological advancements of the U-boats made them practically invisible. Over the course of the Second World War, 2,700 ships were sunk by Nazi U-boats, accounting for roughly 70% of all the Allied losses at seas. Pilots flying overhead didn't have a much easier time surviving either. The Nazis weren't just packing the kind of firepower to destroy tanks, but even had weapons that could be used against vehicles on land and in the sky. The 88mm flak gun was a high-velocity cannon that wasn't just strong enough to defeat any tank armor in the world, but also accurate enough to serve as an anti-aircraft gun, with the Nazis using the same weapon in both modes without the need to make any modifications to it whatsoever. The flak was 25 feet long, fired 8 rounds per minute, and took a 6-man crew to operate. But this cumbersome cannon had an effective range of more than 10,000 meters. So whether in the air, on the ground, or at sea, you were looking at a variety of possible deaths. And if you think staying home and avoiding the war altogether was an option, guess again. In retaliation against the British and American air raids on German cities, the Nazis deployed terrifying revenge weapons against the British citizens in a bid to terrorize and undermine their morale. The Nazis' own propaganda called these weapons the V-1 Doodlebug and the V-2 rockets, Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons that they believed would turn the tide of the war in their favor. The V-1s were flying bombs, often called doodlebugs or buzz bombs, thanks to their distinctive sounds during flight. These bombs were winged and powered by jet engines, launched either from a ramp or later from adapted bomber aircraft. Given that they flew on a straight level trajectory through the skies, many were shot down before reaching their targets, but certainly not all of them. A week after D-Day, multiple British civilians were killed in a V-1 attack that devastated Clapham, a part of South London, on the 13th of June 1944. A few months later, the very first V-2 rockets hit London on the 8th of September 1944. The V-2s were streamlined rockets that stood around 4 stories tall, powered by an engine that burned a mixture of alcohol and water with liquid oxygen. This carried the V-2s literally all the way up into space before they would fall back down to Earth at supersonic speed. One V-2 strike in London on the 27th of March 1945 caused 134 casualties and left hundreds of thousands of civilians homeless after their homes were destroyed. So there you have it. Just a handful of reasons that you wouldn't last a day during World War II. Oh, and private? Don't even think about trying to desert this army either, as even the Allied forces weren't above shooting their own troops who didn't want to fight. China is on the brink of economic collapse, and there's only one man to blame: President Xi Jinping. It may not look like it on the surface. In January 2024, official data out of Beijing showed that China's economy grew by 5.2% in 2023, surpassing the 5% target that Xi had set for the country at the beginning of the year. That's almost double the US growth, which Bloomberg says hit around 2.7%. So it seems all rosy in China, right? Not so fast. Lurking beneath the shiny surface of China's economic apple is a core that is slowly rotting away. And making its way through that core is a devastating worm, Xi himself, who threatens to leave China's economy in turmoil in the coming years. The question is simple: why? Why is Xi the reason for China's economic woes? After all, isn't he the great savior of the country? The man who's pushed China's military through rapid modernization efforts to the point where it's now one of the world's strongest nations? How could he be killing the country's economy? It starts with a couple of words: top-down control. Let's start with that announcement of 5.2% growth for 2023. Official sources in Beijing will tout that as a major success for the country, especially after a fairly lackluster 2022. Xi Jinping could hang his hat on the fact that Chinese growth has outstripped America's, perhaps giving himself a nice little ego boost in the process. But what he might not tell you, and what certainly isn't mentioned in China's official figures, is that Beijing invests about 40% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, every year. That's twice as much as the United States, with such heavy investment even leading to economists saying that the supposedly impressive 5.2% growth rate is actually a disappointing figure when you dig deeper into it. So 5.2% is less great of an achievement for Xi, and more a little ego boost that hides what's really going on. And that's where the concept of top-down control comes into play. Ever since he came into power, Xi has made it his life's work to consolidate. Anything that matters to China falls under his control, with the quote-unquote president taking a near-totalitarian approach to the country's economic policy. That clashes with China's traditional approach, Rather than using the collective decision-making that guided the country in the past, Xi has worked hard to concentrate power into his hands, essentially making the Chinese state and its ruling Communist Party one in the same. Just take his treatment of China's premier, the second highest-ranking official in China's governmental system, as an example. Before Xi took the reins, China's premier typically set the tone of the country's economic policy. That setup saw the premier consulting with a team of experts, with the quality of those experts ultimately determining the success of the policies the premier implemented. The president, for their part, was more of a figurehead in this realm. He'd relay the policies that the premier and his team developed while focusing on the bigger picture for China. That's not how it works anymore. Xi decided China's economic policy needed to shift when he came into power, bringing with it the ideas of stability and, quote, common prosperity. In short, he wanted to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots by creating a policy that gave more Chinese people a chance to gain a share of the wealth that the country generates. It's an admirable approach, but it's one that saw Xi quickly lose faith in his premier and the team of economic experts who informed policymaking before he came along. Unsatisfied with the answers they were giving to his questions, Xi wrested power away from them, becoming a team of one expert, answerable only to himself, on the issues of economic policy. The result, according to some experts, has been an almost anarchic economic environment within China that's often hidden by the official figures coming out of Beijing. Karsten Holz is one of those experts. He studies the Chinese economy as an expert at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and he says that Xi's approach has made it extremely difficult to gain a clear picture of the economic reality in China. He points to issues like an over-indebted property sector and commercial banks' loans books of questionable quality, essentially painting a picture of a system that sees a lot of internal chaos even when it presents itself as one of the strongest in the world. Xi is at the center of all this. And a perfect example comes from his establishment of the National Financial Regulatory Administration, or NFRA. On the surface, the NFRA seems like a step in the right direction. Formed in March 2023 to replace the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, or CBIRC, the new body represents what CNN calls the biggest overhaul of the government in decades. The group will serve a similar purpose to the SEC in the United States, with some of its key responsibilities being to oversee investor and consumer rights in the financial sector while controlling the central bank. The problem? The NFRA represents the blurring of state and Communist Party lines we previously mentioned. Look into its leadership and you'll discover a man named Li Yunxi. Though he previously worked for China Construction Bank and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, Li ascended to the role of Deputy Governor of Sichuan in 2018. He's a Communist Party official. And being an official means that for all of its expertise, Li's actions are ultimately governed by Xi. The Financial Times put his approach in perspective, stating that the formation of the NFRA is really the latest indication of how Xi is seeking to govern through special CCP organs, over which he can more easily assert influence. Again, it's the top-down approach exemplified. The CBIRC certainly has its problems, particularly with corruption, but it was still a state entity rather than a Chinese Communist Party or a CCP one. With the NFRA, Xi demonstrates an outward desire to solve problems inherent to the CBIRC, while actually creating a replacement over which he can exert even more control than he already had. Clamping down on corruption and speculation is all well and good, but it comes at the cost of Xi strengthening his control over Beijing's financial sector. The message from Xi is clear: I know best. But the reality is there are plenty of issues in China that demonstrate the extent of his economic policy failure. Take the creation of China's new anti-espionage law as an example. On the surface, it doesn't seem like it should have anything to do with the economy. But that law sees Beijing raising questions about international businesses handling consulting work within the Chinese security sector, as well as business intelligence work conducted by investors. Not long after that law came into effect, China levied a $1.5 million fine against the American investment firm Mintz Group. The reason? Doing, quote, unapproved statistical work. That unapproved work would have been typical of any investment firm. The company needs to do its due diligence before choosing where to invest its money, but Xi has made it clear that foreign investors can essentially only work from the statistics that China provides for them, with the need for approval from Beijing allowing Xi to hide any economic issues that would cause an investor to be wary. It's all about control. The $1.5 million fine combined an administrative penalty for supposedly breaking the law with China claiming illegal proceeds from the Mintz Group. This could almost be seen as strong-arming the American firm, The raid was essentially a message to the other investment groups that any money they earn from China, especially if they try to take it out of China, could be at risk through the application of Xi's new anti-espionage rules. Like so many of Xi's policies, there's logic behind the policy. He believes that one of the causes of China's economic woes comes down to international investors taking money out of the Chinese economy. And he has a point. In the fourth quarter of 2023 alone, about $140 billion of long-term foreign investment left China, representing about 1% of the nation's GDP. Chatham House showcases why this is a problem, pointing out that just 10 years before, China had actually attracted an influx of foreign investment equivalent to 2% of GDP. It seems that Xi wants the money to keep flowing in, but is extremely hesitant to allow it to flow back out. Unfortunately, the approach of using anti-espionage laws to essentially claim money back from foreign investors will come back to bite him. Investors are now rattled. Rather than seeing China as a place where they can make money, which would encourage them to pump money into the economy, they now see it as a place where they could be punished for simply conducting the due diligence expected of them. As Xianggang Xu, a senior research scholar on China's economy and institutions at Stanford Center says, it's a communist totalitarianism. The goal seems to be for the CCP to control everything, from China's regulatory bodies to its private firms, including foreign firms that have invested so heavily in the country for decades. Xu goes on to say that Xi's desire for control will likely result in a purge of many of those foreign firms, not because they don't add value to China, but because they won't allow themselves to be controlled at such an extent by the CCP. Xi is cutting off his nose to spite his face. By attempting to exert so much control, he's actively dissuading the foreign investors who've played such a huge part in making China an economic powerhouse in the 21st century. So China faces a future where foreign money won't be flowing in. Now let's shift our focus a little closer to home for Xi, the property market. For decades, China was practically dependent on its property market to fuel its economy. As long as the population kept growing, Chinese developers could rely on a near-constant influx of customers for their homes, and Beijing was more than happy to stoke the fires of that industry growth. After all, the property sector created construction jobs for millions, as well as tangible assets through which the country's middle class could store their ever-growing wealth. Even local governments loved the strong property market. They made a fortune from selling lands to developers. That's all fine, until the real estate sector goes pop. This approach to real estate led to the average family having about 70% of their assets tied up in property, ultimately making those families dependent on the strength of the industry. When house prices went up, all was well. But when they started going down, it spelled pain for both the families and China's economy as a whole. The downturn started in 2021. According to Bloomberg, the 2 years between 2021 and 2023 saw existing home prices in over half of China's Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities drop by at least 15% from their peak. For context, every 5% decline in China's house prices represents a loss of 19 trillion yuan, approximately $2.7 trillion in housing wealth. So, 15% means just over $8 trillion gone in the blink of an eye. The culprit behind these massive losses? Xi's property sector policy. In truth, Xi Jinping inherited many of China's property woes. The sector had been the crutch upon which the Chinese economy leaned long before he came along, and he was happy to let it continue that way for several years after his ascension to president in 2013. But about 7 years later, Xi executed a crackdown on China's property development market, with that crackdown serving as his response to the debt being accumulated by the country's developers. Rewind to 2018 and you see a market in shambles. Bloomberg says that 2018 saw real estate account for nearly 20% of China's GDP. But at that same time, it only employed 2% of the country's workforce. And this wasn't glamorous employment. Most of the 16 million people who worked in the industry were migrants, spending long days at construction sites while getting paid a pittance for their efforts. They were essentially building houses they could never afford, with those on top becoming billionaires on the back of their hard work. The more cynical among you might say that that's essentially how capitalism works, but it's not conducive to a thriving economy. If the people in one of your most important industries are barely being paid enough to survive, how can you expect them to pump money into your country's economy? To his credit, Xi recognized rampant corruption, which he'd also allowed to continue, and decided to crack down. We see that in the investigation of Hui Kaiyan, the founder of China's Evergrande Group. In 2017, he became China's richest man. 3 years later, he was under investigation after China Evergrande Group defaulted on a huge number of dollar bonds. So Xi is cracking down on construction in development. Great, but it all came too late. Under Xi, property developers had spent the time between 2013 and 2020 creating what Bloomberg calls a pre-sales model. The idea was simple: sell apartments to customers up to 2 years in advance, allowing the developer to earn operating cash early in the process. Using that money, which came from wiring the prospective owner's down payment and their mortgage into an escrow account, the developer could get to work and deliver the home. The scheme incentivized developers to keep breaking ground, creating a constant stream of new houses that could counteract the rising property prices that were keeping many Chinese people out of homeownership. The scheme grew out of control. By 2020, Xi's crackdowns finally came into effect. Residential construction projects that were under construction accounted for about 10 times the actual amount of completed floor space. The crackdowns came, construction slowed, and now many of China's developers have simply run out of money to build the homes that they've essentially already sold to customers. By 2023, China found itself in a situation where there were 18 unfinished homes, most tied to pre-sales, for every completed property. What we have here is anarchy. Xi's early, some might call it lackadaisical approach to the property market allowed developers to run rampant. The average citizen was priced out while the middle and upper classes saw their assets skyrocket in value. Following the crackdowns, much of China is becoming a sort of development hell. The more affordable homes that were meant to be coming simply aren't being built. And in many areas of China, property prices are plummeting so fast that those who'd invested before are seeing huge portions of their family wealth wiped out. Bloomberg estimates that the correction of the market may affect over 5 million jobs. And it's easy to see why. With developers more hesitant than ever to break ground or finish projects they started, the poor migrant workers who relied on their construction jobs to survive may see China's most important industry wiped out from underneath them. And there are knock-on effects beyond that. Now racked with mountains of debt they're struggling to pay back, Chinese developers are missing their loan payments. For instance, Country Garden Holdings Company, previously one of China's biggest developers in terms of pure sales numbers, is in a $200 billion black hole, with half of the money relating to pre-sold properties. That's money that isn't going to be paid back anytime soon. So not only do the people who bought the homes that aren't being built going to suffer, but so will China's state-owned banks that are now tied into this debt through the mortgages they provided. Add to all of that the failed loan payments, and you have a financial sector that's going to struggle under the weight of loans it perhaps should never have made. Xi knows that China needs to reduce its reliance on property. His mantra has always been that housing is to be lived in, not speculated on. But the approach he's taken has created enormous problems for many in China, from regular citizens to developers, banks, and the country's middle class. Housing to be lived in is only effective when that housing is actually being built, and property is far from the only problem. China's manufacturing sector is also struggling massively, and its downfall happens to coincide with the years in which Xi has held power. In the year that Xi took power, China was the world's factory. Its manufacturing sector accounted for 31% of China's GDP, putting it ahead of even the property industry. But by 2020, the sector's contribution to GDP had dropped so significantly that it was only accounting for 26%. Even now, in 2023, it hovers around the 27% to 28% mark. What happened? Part of the issue comes down to other countries emerging as more attractive propositions for companies that need manufacturing. Vietnam and Mexico have emerged as major competitors to China in the years since Xi took power, snatching away some of the foreign investment into the sector from Beijing's clutches. But perhaps far more damaging, as well as being a contributing factor to other countries rising as manufacturing players, is Xi's Made in China 2025 initiative. Announced in May 2015, the goal of this policy was to have China shed its reputation as the world's factory. No longer would China be the byword for cheap and low-quality goods because it offered low labor costs to the rest of the world. Instead, China would focus on the innovation-driven production of much higher-value goods. Again, it seems like a logical policy on the surface. Yes, China would lose some foreign investment from companies that previously relied on it for low manufacturing costs, but Xi's policy would supposedly turn it into a manufacturing powerhouse, with Chinese goods making money for Chinese companies, propelling the country's economy in the process. We've already seen from the statistics that this didn't happen. Though many overseas saw this policy as an attempt by China to first catch up to and then move past Western technological prowess, the reality is that Made in China 2025 simply encouraged foreign investors into the country's manufacturing industry to look elsewhere. Just as Xi's anti-espionage laws from 2023 are warding off investors, so too is China's shift toward trying to position itself as a manufacturing innovator. In fact, the policy was so impactful overseas, it became the impetus for the trade war that marked much of Donald Trump's time as U.S. president. Xi's approach was to provide governmental subsidies to companies that he believed would be able to propel China's manufacturing sector forward. However, according to the Center for Economic Policy Research, or CEPR, Beijing has never made the list of companies that got the nod from Xi public. We know that some of the Chinese manufacturers are receiving subsidies from the CCP. We just don't know who or why. All of that information is controlled by Xi, again demonstrating how his top-down economic policy is causing problems for China. Instead of strengthening Chinese companies, Made in China 2025 sparked restrictions, tariffs, and export controls from many of its key trading partners. Xi responded with trade restrictions of his own, leading to the situation we see now. China isn't the manufacturing powerhouse it once was. So, we see how Xi's top-down approach has wreaked havoc on China's property and manufacturing sectors. We also see just how much he's doing to ward off foreign investment, making China more insular at a time when it could really do with attracting solid injections of overseas cash. But Xi's done more than alienate foreign investors and shatter China's property development sector. He had a terrible impact on the local level too. Prior to Xi implementing his 2020 property market crackdowns, regional governments generated about a third of their income from land sales. By 2022, the amount was closer to 10%, with ailing developers no longer able to afford the land that local governments wanted to sell to them. During that same time, local government responsibility for general expenditure reached 86%, a record high in the 42 years of statistics available from China's National Bureau of Statistics. This isn't all Xi's doing. Local government finances have been deteriorating since the 1994 introduction of the tax sharing system, which kickstarted China's economic burden falling more to local governments than national governments. At the time of the reform, local governments' collective share of China's revenue was a little over 75%. In 1994, that plummeted below 50% and had only just managed to crawl above that 50% barrier since Xi took charge. Not great when those same governments have to deal with 85% of Chinese expenditure, but Xi has done little to solve the problem. Yes, he cleaned up 12 trillion yuan, or about $1.67 billion of local government financing vehicles, or LGFV debt, during his first term as president, but by 2022, liabilities related to LGFVs had rocketed up to 57 trillion yuan, or about $7.92 trillion. That's 48% of China's GDP, almost level with the national borrowing, and it's one of the main reasons that China's debt-to-GDP ratio has risen to 360%, compared to the 200% it was when Xi took over. And now, by taking away land as a means to generate income for local governments, Xi's created a system that will see many of its cities, especially its smaller ones, doomed to fail. There's a saying in China, those in Beijing hold the purse strings, while local cadres hold dirty shovels. The implication is that while all of the smaller cities and towns do the dirty work, Beijing rakes in the money and ultimately controls how much of the money those smaller locales receive. Xi might not have created the policy, but he has perpetuated it, much to the detriment of local government finances. And all of this is in service of creating a stronger China in which the wealth inequality gap is shortened. But even that noble ambition isn't coming to pass. Though Xi goes to great lengths to talk about how his policies are designed to prevent wealth inequality, the fact is that China's elite are richer than its low and middle income households than ever before. The top 20% of the country's urban households earn 6.3 times more than the bottom 20%, the highest gap since 1985. All of this means that China has a cavalcade of problems. Its economic growth is unimpressive when taken into context with its GDP expenditure. The property market is in shambles, with the manufacturing sector also struggling. And given that these are China's two most important industries, it should come as no surprise then that youth unemployment is high, according to the BBC. And all of this has knock-on effects for the rest of the world. Due to all of Xi's failed policies, China's consumer market is weakening. That's bad news for the global companies that sell to Chinese consumers, such as Apple, because that means they're receiving less revenue from China. Less money to those major multinationals results in lower demand for supplies, affecting thousands of companies within the supply chains of those major hitters. So Xi's failures don't just lead to unemployment and economic woes in China. They cause the same issues for many of the foreign businesses that have relied for so long on Chinese consumers propping up their record profits. The question now is simple. Is there a light at the end of the economic tunnel for Xi Jinping? One positive he can take from all of this is that household deposits in China exceeded the country's GDP. That's a symptom of the stock market crash of 2015, which occurred during Xi's stint, leading to more Chinese people choosing to save rather than invest. These savings give the state-owned banks a cheap source of money, which they can then use to provide loans to high-end manufacturing companies. And it's certainly the case that loans to these types of companies, which are intended to be the beneficiaries of Xi's Made in China 2025 policy, have skyrocketed. But can one small win mean much when measured against the devastation wrought elsewhere? Perhaps Xi is the only man who has the answer. After all, he seems to believe he has the answers to everything in China. Still, what do you think? Are worries about China's economic woes overblown? Perhaps you believe Xi has some sort of master plan he's waiting to unleash. Or are we simply watching a totalitarian ruler who's allowing his country's people and financial institutions to be placed under immense stress, all in service of his political party gaining more control? Tell us what you think in the comments below. In the USA, your odds of winning the Powerball lottery jackpot is around 1 in 292.2 million. If you spent 80 years buying the Mega Millions lottery twice a week, you'd still be more likely to get struck by lightning than go home with some money. You're also statistically more likely to date a supermodel, win an Oscar, have identical quadruplets, become an Olympic athlete, get eaten by a shark, and even become a saint in the Catholic Church. And thank God that's the case, because sometimes winning the lottery is less like a blessing and more like a truly horrific curse. Financial ruin, drug addiction, social isolation, and even being murdered by someone close to you are suddenly in the cards. Don't believe us? Here are some horrifying stories of people who had their lives ruined by hitting the jackpot, which we'll use to go a little deeper into why the lottery might lead you from riches to rags. Let's begin with the tragic tale of a man whose name was as awesome as his luck was terrible. Florida lottery winner Abraham Shakespeare. Mr. Shakespeare netted a $30 million win in 2006, a life-changing amount of money, in the worst way possible. He was a complicated man. Before his sudden influx of wealth, he was an assistant truck driver who lived with his mother, had a criminal history, and could barely read and write. After getting rich overnight, Shakespeare moved to a fancy gated community and bought nice cars and a Rolex, as many of us would if we became multimillionaires overnight. Shakespeare was notoriously generous with his money, something that a con woman named Doris D.D. Moore was eager to take advantage of. She approached him under the pretense that she wanted to write a book about his life, but she actually had much more sinister intentions. Through a business she started with Shakespeare, Abraham Shakespeare LLC, she siphoned off more than $1 million of the man's winnings, but it didn't stop there. In 2009, Shakespeare was reported missing by his family, and in 2010 his body would be discovered, buried behind the house. As you probably have guessed by this point, he'd been murdered, and the prime suspect in this murder was his toxic business partner, Doris D.D. Moore. After a lengthy trial, Dee was eventually convicted of Shakespeare's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shakespeare's brother, Robert Brown, was quoted as saying, "I'd have been better off broke. He said that to me all the time." Shakespeare had no idea how right he was. Even though Shakespeare was murdered, at least some justice was able to be served in the end. The same cannot be said for the mysterious lottery-related death of Chicago's Uruj Khan, who won $425,000. However, he'd never actually lived to see the money, as in the process of collecting it, Khan mysteriously dropped dead. A truly random tragedy. Perhaps the 46-year-old's heart simply gave out from excitement of winning life-changing money. It clearly meant a lot to him. As he himself said, "Winning the lottery means everything to me." However, after his loved ones came forward and asked for the Cook County medical examiner Stephen Sina to reopen the case, this was the point where they discovered that the cause of Khan's death wasn't so natural. He died after ingesting a fatal dose of cyanide, only made worse by Khan's dangerously clogged arteries. However, because the autopsy was made 6 months after Khan's death, and because, in accordance with Muslim traditions, he hadn't been embalmed, his body was in too deep a state of decomposition to learn any more about how Khan had ingested the cyanide. It's unlikely we'll ever know, but one thing seems clear. The fact that Khan would somehow ingest a fatal quantity of cyanide just after he won the lottery definitely seems too perfect to be a coincidence. Either way, winning the lottery certainly didn't improve Uruj Khan's life. While both those stories are unquestionably tragic, the next one is downright disturbing. We're talking about the fate that befell 20-year-old forklift operator Gregory Birch Jr. when he won the $400,000 jackpot in 2015, the first domino in a brief and upsetting series of events that would end Birch Jr.'s life. Upon hearing about Gregory's windfall, a gang of 7 men led by a gang member named Debrentes Overstreet, a rival name to Abraham Shakespeare, decided that they wanted some of that money, even if it meant using lethal force. 2 months after the win, without warning, they shot through the door of Gregory's Georgia home and stormed in, guns blazing. As Gregory was holding his 2-year-old child, his girlfriend, Jasmine Hendricks, was also in the room during the holdup. Gregory pleaded for the life of his girlfriend and child, begging, "Don't do it, bro. Don't do it in front of my kids. Please don't do it in front of my kids and old lady. I'll give you my bank card." But this wasn't enough. He tried to take off and give his pants to the robbers when he couldn't find his wallet, but they shot him in both legs in their frustration before fleeing. This would be bad enough, but they came back soon after and finished the job, murdering Gregory in front of his girlfriend and infant child. The men were caught and convicted, but this would be little comfort to Jasmine and the child, who lost a partner and a father, all because they'd come into some money that local criminals were eager to steal. After this tragic event, the Georgia Lottery started letting its winners choose to remain anonymous. If only they'd provided this option sooner, Gregory might still be with us. Next, we have one of the most infamous unlucky lottery winners of all time, Andrew Jack Whitaker. This West Virginia man was the president of Diversified Enterprises Construction and was hardly a pauper. He already had a net worth of around $17 million. However, this was small potatoes compared to the epic win he was about to get on the Powerball, an utterly insane $314.9 million. It was the largest amount of money ever won on an American lottery ticket, so naturally, it would have some legendary lore attached to it too. Initially, things seemed to be going well. He gave generously to charity, even creating his own charitable foundation. He gave a large sum of money to the owner of the convenience store where he bought the winning ticket. He even drove around his neighborhood throwing handfuls of cash out the window for anyone who happened to be walking by. Life was good, but that goodness wouldn't last for long. $500,000 were robbed from Jack's car while he was visiting a strip club. This would be the only successful attempt of 3 different incidents where greedy strangers conspired to rob Jack of his winnings. But the tragedy of this pales in comparison to the death of Jack's beloved granddaughter, 17-year-old Brandy Bragg, who died of a drug overdose under mysterious circumstances. Many years later, Jack's daughter and Brandy's mother, Ginger Whitaker Bragg, was found dead in her West Virginia home under tragic circumstances. Jack really just couldn't win. On top of all these personal struggles, the lottery winnings also brought him a myriad of legal troubles. Caesars Atlantic City Casino even sued him for bouncing $1.5 million worth of checks to cover gambling losses, which led to a longer legal dispute between him and the casino. He also dealt with a DUI in 2003 and even had his house burned down in 2016. The seemingly endless unlucky streak of Jack Whitaker would come to a close in June of 2020 when he passed away after suffering from a long illness. It's one of the few misfortunes that seem to have nothing to do with his lottery winnings. Okay, let's take a brief break from this parade of human misery. Don't worry, we'll get to more later. There is sadly no shortage of these stories. Let's take a deeper look now at our central question: why is winning the lottery the worst thing that can happen to you? As much as people, and generally annoying people who are comfortably wealthy already, will tell you that money can't buy happiness, there are plenty of problems in our lives that feel like they could be solved overnight by suddenly becoming a multi-millionaire or even a billionaire. We never need to worry about food or shelter. We could pay off any outstanding bills, debts, or student loans, and we could leave that rat race and relax, using our newfound mega bucks to live out our dreams and donate to causes and charities we believe in. You could probably even afford YouTube Premium. So what's the problem here? Why does life-changing money so often seem to change people's lives for the worse? Of course, there are plenty of people who would win the lottery and go on to live happy, successful lives. We literally just explained all the anxiety-inducing problems that just seem to vanish when lottery winners spend their winnings responsibly. You may have heard the statistic that 70% of lottery winners go bankrupt within 5 years of their big win. But this is actually a piece of commonly repeated misinformation based on a 2001 symposium organized by the National Endowment on Financial Education. A data point you probably haven't heard of is the result of a 2020 study conducted in collaboration between Stockholm University, Stockholm School of Economics, and New York University that had a sample of 3,000 Swedish lottery winners, surveying their lives from 5 to 22 years after the big win. The result? The researchers found that the winners had sustained increases in overall life satisfaction. But why? Why do we lust over horror stories of lottery wins gone bad when the stories of lottery winnings drastically improving people's lives seem to go unnoticed? Simply put, it's likely linked to how we started the video. Winning the lottery is astronomically unlikely. Despite these odds, 181 million people play the Powerball every year, despite the fact that so many of these people statistically will never ever win. And we've seen the number of players rising, as it seems like the economy is designed to do less and less for the average person. For many, it seems like the lottery is the only way to escape the horrors of poverty and debt. But again, most people simply will not get a lottery win. This makes it a more pleasing narrative to believe that the winners are worse off than the losers, that really we're the lucky ones for not winning. It's just less painful than thinking that the ladder out of struggle can be accessed by so few. But why do some of those few spin out into tragedy, even if statistically the people whose lives are destroyed are actually in the minority? Of course, the lottery can change how others see you, and even worse, how they behave toward you. Some lottery winners have reported distant relatives they haven't talked to in years, or ones they haven't talked to at all, like their fourth cousin 3 times removed, Count Olaf, trying to get a piece of their new fortune. And how could you turn down a family member? They're flesh and blood after all. But it won't stop there, of course. Been meaning to get in contact with some old friends? Don't worry. After your big lottery win, they might try to contact you again. And of course, they'll be very interested in getting closely acquainted with you and might even tell you about some of their money troubles over a few drinks. And you want to be a good friend, don't you? You likely will feel obligated to pay off those debts just to be a considerate pal. Oh, did you think it would stop there? We're sorry to disappoint you, because when the news of your next big win went public, stockbrokers and investing consultants may also get in touch, telling you about brilliant projects and miracle stocks that just so happen to be once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunities, ready to be given cash injection by a newly minted baller like you. They'll tell you that these opportunities will double, triple your current fortune, though it may leave you a lot worse off than you started. The same can be said for charities and philanthropic opportunities. We don't want you to think we're being cold-hearted here. It's good to give to charities if you can afford it and if those charities are ethical. But when you win the lottery, representatives of various charities may become travel agents who specialize in sending you on a guilt trip. Who knows how much of your lucky winnings you'll give away just to take the weight off your heart. In an interview, the 2006 Missouri lottery winner Sandra Hayes once said, "I had to endure the greed and the need people have trying to get you to release your money to them. That caused a lot of emotional pain. There are people who you've loved deep down, and they're turning to vampires, trying to suck the life out of me." Though it's better to have the life sucked out of you in a purely metaphorical sense than to have it snuffed out of you by the people who want to get their hands on your money. As we've sadly seen in a lot of our examples, there are just as many people who'd happily murder you if it meant getting a slice of your lottery-won pie, or at the very least rob you blind without a second thought. Returning to Sandra Hayes from earlier, she was almost a victim of a con from a guilt-tripping friend who claimed she was about to lose her house due to being unable to pay 3 years of back taxes. Just before Sandra could help her friend out, she decided to do some due diligence and check public tax records related to her friend, finding out that all of her taxes had actually been paid in full. When Sandra confronted her friend about this, their relationship quickly broke down. As you've seen, this is still one of the more mild stories to come out of lottery misfortune. That being said, sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. The term sudden wealth syndrome is often applied to people who spin out after becoming unexpectedly rich overnight without having any pre-existing wealth management knowledge. We've all heard the stories of celebrities like Nicolas Cage splurging on castles and dinosaur bones, and when the average person becomes as well off as Nick Cage without needing to star in National Treasure first, there's a tendency to go even crazier with the metaphorical checkbook. You've seen it in the stories: luxury cars, mega mansions, and sadly lots and lots of drugs. That was the case for the unfortunately named Willie Hurt, who blew all of his 1989 $3.1 million jackpot on crack cocaine. It's the true meaning of the phrase "easy come, easy go." Money won rather than earned seems to lend itself to more frivolous spending, soon landing the winner in a deeper hole than they started in before the money ever found its way to their hands. Evelyn Adams was lucky enough to win the lottery twice, once in 1985 and 1986, and allegedly blew all $4.5 million of her winnings in casinos in Atlantic City. Canada's Gerald Muswagon got it even worse in 1998 when he won $10 million on the Super 7 jackpot and decided to party it all down the drain. According to Canada's Globe and Mail, he bought several new vehicles for himself and friends, purchased a house that turned into a nightly party pad, and often celebrated his new lifestyle with copious amounts of drugs and alcohol. In a single day, he bought 8 big-screen televisions for friends. His rampant partying and a series of bad investments in an unprofitable logging company soon resulted in his new fortune collapsing. After being forced into heavy labor just to make ends meet, he ended up taking his own life in 2005. It's a slightly more tragic version of the experience of the UK's Michael Carroll, a garbage man who ended up winning the equivalent of $15 million at only 19. He ended up blowing all this money on his insane number of vices: crack cocaine, parties, prostitutes, and luxury cars. That $15 million was turned into a big fat zero in a mere 5 years, and Michael worked in sanitation again. On the subject of impulse buying, one former winner said, "After we won the lottery, we bought an 8-bedroom, 7-bath, 10,000 square foot mansion because we could, and it sounded amazing. Well, now we're selling the 8-bedroom, 7-bath mansion because it's impractical for a family of 4. With that, let's turn to some of the horrifying stories of unlucky people whose lotteries condemned them to live lives of misery and woe. It takes a lot of work to maintain a healthy relationship. Love, compassion, honesty, respect, and communication are all essential for making it work. And few things test all of that better than a sudden windfall of $750,000 after a big lottery win. Thanks to the stories of winners like Sandra Hayes, it's easy to see why some people want to keep their winnings close to their chests, but sometimes this can create even bigger problems. Just ask Lynn Ann Poirier. Poirier and her partner Howard Browning were into the lottery to an unusual degree. The Florida couple bought tickets as often as they could, working under the verbal contract that if ever one of them won, they'd split the winnings in half, fair and square. But that's an easy deal to make when you haven't actually won yet. When Poirier made off well on the Florida Lottery's Firecracker Millionaire raffle, she disappeared for a month with the full $750,000, to the disappointment and horror of Howard. What followed 6 months later was a heated legal battle between Lynn and Howard, litigating in the Florida Trial Court, the Florida 5th District Court of Appeal, and even the Florida Supreme Court. The meat of the argument was based on whether or not Lynn needed to honor a verbal contract, and in the end, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that she did. It was a win for Howard, but that win didn't leave him much better off. Lynn Ann Poirier claimed that she'd already spent the money and declared bankruptcy, which Howard contested. The lottery winnings brought this couple nothing but strife. Lottery winnings can tear apart domestic partners, but surely they can't break the unstoppable bond between brothers, right? Nope, wrong. Just to get in a time machine and ask William Bud Post, who won over $16 million in the Pennsylvania lottery back in 1988. Within a year of his big win, it wasn't just all gone, he was $1 million in debt. A third of his winnings were sued out of him by an ex-girlfriend, and the majority of the rest was sunken into an unsuccessful family business. But if this wasn't bad enough for Bud, his own brother was arrested for allegedly hiring a hitman to kill him so he could get a portion of the money. Bud would also later end up in jail for firing a gun over the head of a bill collector, hoping to right some of Bud's many debts. He said of the whole horrible experience, "I wish it never happened. It was totally a nightmare. I was much happier when I was broke." There's one thing worse than a family member attempting to murder you for your lottery winnings: a family member succeeding in murdering you for your lottery winnings, as was the case for E.B. Roncaioli of Ontario back in 1991. E.B. won $5 million on a lottery draw and ended up giving $2 million of those winnings to a secret child that she'd had with someone else. Her jealous husband, Joseph Roncaioli, poisoned her to death with painkillers when he found out about the money. Just another casualty of the lottery. According to YouGov, 4% of adult men and 1% of adult women in the U.S. think about the Roman Empire daily. We want to substantially increase those numbers, so we thought we'd take a little trip through time and reveal what caused the momentous rise and disastrous fall of one of history's most famous empires. Was it outside invaders, political corruption, crumbling infrastructure, or tax evasion? The answer may surprise you, although it likely includes a wide variety of factors. Our team of researchers dug through the ruins, read countless books, and conquered numerous territories in an attempt to replicate the events of and understand the inner workings of the Roman Empire. Before we really begin, we should distinguish between Rome and the Roman Empire, which are not the same thing. You see, before Rome was a massive sprawling empire, it was a republic. We recognize that things often happen differently in human history. Monarchies gradually become representational governments, but Rome decided to reverse the order. According to legend, the city was originally founded by twin brothers Romulus and Remus, all the way back in 753 BC. They were rumored to be demigods, the sons of Mars, the god of war, abandoned by a nearby king, and rescued and raised by a female wolf. As is common with brothers, especially those raised by pack animals, a fight broke out between them, either over where the city would be located or who would rule it. Yet, unlike most sibling fights, Romulus ended up killing Remus, thus achieving sole power and giving Rome his name. In yet another version, a woman named Roma, who was traveling in Aeneas's entourage along with other survivors from the sack of Troy, went to the Tiber River and absolutely refused to venture any further in their journey. To show she was serious and underscore her point to the men, she and other women burned all their ships, meaning everyone in the group ended up staying in the Rome area, whether they wanted to or not. Now, assuming that it's unlikely that two demigods raised by a wolf founded a city, and knowing that the aftermath of the Trojan War is still quite unclear, there's a good chance that these stories just may be fabricated. But they contribute to the myths and legends surrounding Rome. What we do know about the beginnings of the eventual mighty empire is that archaeological records indicate that Rome was founded in approximately 625 BC, and it likely started as a small trading center on the banks of the Tiber, and eventually developed into a city. Why and how did this happen? Well, at the time, the areas in which the town was located were called Etruria and Latium. Citizens were organized into multiple villages in the region, and they may have unified to defend themselves against an invasion of neighboring Etruscans. A competing theory suggests that the Etruscan invasion was successful and is actually what consolidated the little villages into the city known as Rome. You see, one of the problems with things that happened in 625 BC is that it's hard to find people who will give you a definitive answer about what took place back then. Regardless of what specific event brought the villagers together into a larger conglomerate, the historical record indicates a lot of upheaval and unification around 600 BC. So it's clear that by that time, Rome had moved on up in the world from its humble trading center origins. As it was setting out on its own and finding itself, much like most college students, Rome underwent several changes in its identity. Until 510 BC, Rome was firmly in its period of kings era, meaning it had established itself as a monarchy. At least 7 different rulers oversaw the city during this time. The kings came from earlier lines of royalty left by preceding civilizations, most notably Etruscan, Sabine, and the Latin lines of kings. Unlike most monarchies, the succession of the 7 kings of Rome was not hereditary. In a nod to the foundations that would eventually enable Rome's transition into a republic, the kings were elected by the Senate. After the legendary first king Romulus, the son of a wolf and the god of war, who admittedly may have been a tough act to follow, Numa Pompilius arrived on the scene. The lines of kings continued to include Tullus Hostilius, who we swear is not a Hogwarts professor but an actual Roman king, Ancus Martius, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, known as Tarquin the Elder, Servius Tullius, and finally, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known as Tarquin the Proud. The last king, or Rex, as referred to by the Romans at the time, was apparently much less beloved than his predecessors. Historians have found evidence to indicate that his rule was widely regarded as tyrannical, with the public largely against him. Well, this came to a boiling point when Lucius Superbus's son allegedly forced himself upon a well-liked noblewoman, Lucretia. Roman residents and nobles alike reacted with rage and wanted Lucius Superbus and his son out of power. Eventually, the king was overthrown, and Rome transitioned into a republic. The word itself derives from the Latin for property of the people, res publica. If you've ever studied for the SATs, you know that it's just one of many words based on Latin roots that will keep you up at night studying for the vocabulary section. The transition to the republic wasn't out of the blue, as some recognition of people's rights already existed. Rome's very own constitution had already been established during its first monarchical period. After becoming a republic, the city prospered, expanding its borders through military conquests, leveling up its economy and production of goods, and increasing trade with its neighbors. However, this wasn't exactly the fair and balanced representative government that you might be picturing, at least not initially. See, Rome was divided into patricians and plebeians. Patricians were members of wealthy Roman families, and they were the only ones who could hold elected office and religious office. So instead of being ruled by the people at large, the Romans were now ruled by senators and knights, meaning the upper classes held all the power. This made Rome totally different from the republics that exist today. Occasionally, if the upper classes felt it was merited, they could nominate a dictator to guide them through times of crisis, but for the most part, the rule of the patricians held for centuries. However, this wasn't solely achieved through the famed Roman Senate. Although the Senate existed at the time, it wasn't the formal lawmaking body of the republic. The members were also appointed, not elected, an important distinction from today's legislative bodies. However, the powerful patrician members of the Senate held great sway in society and exercised it over Rome's actual lawmaking groups to get their way. The patricians looked down on the other segment of society, the plebeians, and enacted laws mostly of their own benefit. However, the plebeians, justifiably discontent with the state of affairs, struggled to gain more control within the government of the Roman Republic. From the start of the Republic in 509 BC until 494 BC, the Senate persisted as the only governing body within the state under the leadership of two consuls. That was until the plebeians organized a strike to assume some power. In a victory for both the unions and democracies everywhere, the strike worked. This led to the establishment of several legislative bodies created to give more power to the people. These were divided up as follows. Comitia Centuriata passed laws, made decisions regarding acts of war, and elected consuls, censors, and praetors. The Consilium Plebis, though it started as a ruling body specifically for the plebeians, it eventually expanded its scope of power to make decrees that applied to all people in Rome, including the patricians. The Comitia Tributa was in charge of electing minor officials and was generally in charge of the more local matters, dispensing justice by enacting fines rather than sentences. It was open to all Roman citizens, well, at least those who were free adults in possession of a penis, which was the case in most ancient societies. The two consuls in charge of this all commanded both the Roman military and oversaw the Senate, not unlike the current powers of the President of the United States. However, as opposed to the former Roman monarchs, the consuls had substantial limitations on their powers. First off, they could only serve for 1 year, leaving them limited time to accrue and thus wield power. Second, there were additional magistrate positions within the Roman Republic that also held decision-making power, thereby keeping the consuls in check. To further strengthen the Republic and the rule of law, the Romans decided to codify many new laws at the time. In 451 BC, they came up with something known as the 12 Tables, a collection of laws about politics, as well as private and public affairs. Thanks to continued expansion during Rome's existence as a republic, by 338 BC, this once small city-state was ruling the entire Italian boot-shaped peninsula. Of course, this expansion was far from linear, as they did suffer quite a few setbacks. For example, the neighboring Gauls came in and sacked Rome in 390 BC. However, the young republic managed to build again and take control of all of Italy under the leadership of Camillus, a revered military leader. Further expansion occurred during the Punic Wars, which lasted from 264 BC to 146 BC and were fought between Carthage and Rome. At the time, Carthage was an impressive and incredibly powerful city-state on the northern coast of Africa, approximately located near modern-day Tunis, Tunisia. There were 3 Punic Wars in total. After the first 2, Rome expanded to control the western Mediterranean, including Spain and the island of Sicily. They also defeated one of the greatest generals and military tacticians of all time, the legendary Hannibal. Though he continued to rule Carthage for some time after being defeated by the Romans, his financial and tax reforms enacted to pay back the massive war debt imposed by Rome made him extremely unpopular. He eventually fled east all the way to the court of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey, where he was betrayed and revealed to the Romans. To avoid capture, he poisoned himself. At the end of the Third Punic War, which took place between 149 and 146 BC, Rome finally bested its formidable foe and burned the city of Carthage to the ground. Many surviving citizens were sold into slavery, and this entire region became a Roman province. Simultaneously, Rome also expanded eastward, defeating the once mighty kingdom of Macedonia in the Macedonian Wars, 200 years after Alexander the Great had overseen his own kingdom's rapid expansion. Aside from the increased territory and economic clout that the acquisition of these provinces via military victory gave Rome, they also helped to develop Roman society and culture as a whole. As you may have noticed, if you ever walked through an Italian city, Rome took quite a lot of architectural, religious, and artistic details from the Greeks and integrated them into its society. The Greek pantheon of the gods was given new names and turned into a Roman pantheon. Roman literature got an incredible jumpstart by translating a lot of classic Greek texts into Latin. The writings of Greek philosophers influenced a lot of Roman thinking and philosophy going forward as well. Perhaps this was part of the reason for Rome's relative success. Instead of solely concentrating on burning their captured cities to the ground, though they did that sometimes too, they also acquired a lot of knowledge, art, and new perspectives from the civilizations they conquered. By this time, the Roman military had become a formidable force. The military might and territorial expansion marked Rome as the premier power in the Mediterranean, one of the ancient world's foremost centers of economic activity. Alas, it seems the Roman Republic expanded too fast for its own good. The Republic started to fall apart from within, leading to political instability and eventually civil war. Discontent led to turmoil, reform, and coup attempts, as inequality spread throughout society. Thanks to wealthy landowners using their resources and power to push small farmers out of public land. The wealthy patricians also used their considerable force to exert pressure on the government, so the Senate increasingly ended up working in their favor, reversing many of the earlier gains made by plebeians in society. Disagreements among leaders led to factions forming within the government, some supporting plebeians, others patricians, and some military. Gaius Marius, a military leader, became consul in 107 BC and ruled for several terms, acting more like a warlord than a leader. This made him many enemies, and by 91 BC he faced challenges for power, including from General Sulla. Taking advantage of a Roman tradition allowing dictators to be elected occasionally, the upper class elected L. Cornelius Sulla in 82 BC. Despite being a dictator, Sulla surprisingly stepped down in 79 BC. However, the state's growing reliance on strong rulers during times of trouble marked the shift from republic to empire. A lot of Romans ended up wanting to change the status quo. Some took the path of working within the system to try to course-correct the wayward direction of the Roman Republic. This included leaders like the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who enacted several social reforms during the period of 133 to 122 BC to help the poorest members of Roman society. Unfortunately, they were killed for their troubles, which seemingly discouraged anyone else from trying to help the poor. Others took a more violent approach to political change. In the 1st century BC, Roman Senator Lucius Catiline, along with a whole contingent of Romans who fought for the poor and downtrodden and had become incredibly discontent with the state of Roman society, laid out a plan to overthrow the government. He was about to go through with it when he was discovered by Marcus Cicero, a famous Roman orator who exposed him to the Senate. After his failed insurrection attempt, an army of the Roman Republic chased Catiline into Gaul and murdered him and most of his followers. The Republic became incredibly unstable and was embroiled in endless civil wars. This fostered a further gravitation towards strong dictatorial leaders, and eventually it all came to a head with one man, Julius Caesar. Caesar assumed power in 60 BC and had an ambitious vision for a Roman Empire. He sought to conquer huge swaths of mainland Europe, far away from the Mediterranean countries and the coasts that the Republic had controlled. He started venturing north, and by 51 BC had taken over Celtic Gaul. In addition to power and prestige, this gave him a significant amount of wealth, as he could steal Gaul's resources and people. Though Rome hadn't fully become an empire yet, as the Senate was still in existence, the senators' powers were significantly weakening. This was best exemplified when they ordered Caesar to turn back and forego his conquests of Gaul, and Caesar responded by completely ignoring them and doing what he was going to do anyway. While maintaining immense popularity with the Roman public, thanks to his successful military exploits and popular writings about travel and politics, Caesar continued to rankle other senators and former allies, creating a troubling stir in Roman politics. This was part of the reason he was eventually assassinated in 44 BC. Over 60 conspirators, many of them political officials, gathered together on March 15, now forever called the Ides of March by pretentious people, and stabbed Caesar 23 times during a meeting of the Senate. If the assassins thought the death of the headstrong Caesar would solve their problems and help them get some of their power back, they could not have been more wrong. Due to Caesar's popularity with the people, the public turned completely against the Senate, whose wealthy, out-of-touch members they hadn't exactly loved to begin with. This led to multiple civil wars until a new ruler emerged, Caesar's grandnephew and adoptive son. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, better known as Octavian for short. He took his place and ruled alongside Caesar's former friend, Mark Antony, the Roman emperor, not the Latin singing sensation, and he renamed himself Augustus Caesar, a nod to his adoptive father. When Mark Antony was killed during Rome's conquest of Egypt, Augustus remained the sole ruler. This made him the first official emperor of Rome, achieving the ambitious aims of his father. His reign was long and prosperous, lasting 41 years and representing a golden age for the empire. In fact, this period became known as Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace. Before Augustus's ascension, the Roman Republic had undergone a long period of crisis, instability, and turmoil, and the people were quite frankly tired of it. So Augustus's restoration of stability within political institutions was very welcome, even at the price of establishing a sovereign ruler for life. Instead of expanding Roman territories, Augustus traveled through his lands to quell revolts and encourage peaceful coexistence with the people Rome had previously conquered. He then focused his attention on creating stability and prosperity back home. During the Pax Romana, Augustus enacted many social reforms. He wanted to restore his vision of morality in the Roman Empire and passed several laws to discourage adultery and encourage the birth of children. In fact, families with 3 or more children were frequently rewarded, especially if the kids happened to be boys. This contrasts starkly with the promiscuous, indulgent, and downright Epicurean image we have of most Roman emperors today. In some surprisingly progressive moves, Augustus also granted women citizenship and a number of rights, such as the right to inherit property and to manage their own finances. He also provided a path for slaves to gain freedom, though he made it quite clear that there would be a limit on how many slaves could actually become free. Augustus also established a regular census to ensure a fairer taxation system and win the support of even more people. This helped accurately assess the tax burden of the provinces and made collection fairer and more manageable for Roman citizens. Lastly, Augustus created the Praetorian Guard, veterans of the Roman legions and carefully screened and selected to serve as the emperor's bodyguards. Literature, architecture, and art reached an apex during Augustus's reign, and many of the most famous Roman sculptures and writings hail from this period, like the Ara Pacis Augustae, built between 13 and 9 BC. Due to all these factors and his benevolent rule, Augustus was loved by the people both during his reign and after. After his death, he was immortalized as a god, and he wouldn't be the last Roman emperor to be bestowed with this honor. Augustus's rule moved Rome into its imperial period, perhaps the time it's best known for, as after his rule, Rome conquered, well, pretty much everything it could get its hands on. The kingdom prospered and expanded, maintaining power by assimilating many of the people it conquered into its empire, but also, horrifically, making a fair amount of conquered people slaves, working for the construction and advancement of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, not every Roman emperor was as well regarded, competent, and widely respected as Augustus. Many of you may have heard of the oft-mentioned historical figure Caligula. Known in historical circles as a crazy and violent emperor, Caligula's name eventually became used in modern society as a stand-in for anyone deemed to be extravagantly evil and unstable. Perhaps it came as no surprise to everyone, except him at least, that his life ended via assassination. Caligula had developed an unfortunate habit of sending several members of the patrician class to death on conspiracy charges, whether merited or not. This understandably significantly soured relations between the emperor and his senate. One day in late January 41 AD, Caligula was making his way to lunch through an underground passage in the Palatine when 2 tribunes of the Praetorian Guard, Cornelius Sabinius and Cassius Chaerea, murdered him. Historians doubt that they committed this act entirely by themselves. Several notable Romans, including the politicians Annius Vinicianus, Valerius Asiaticus, and commander Marcus Clemens, were implicated in the plot to assassinate Caligula. However, it seems like no one bothered to investigate all that much after the emperor was killed, a see something, say nothing policy, if you will. So one might say that Caligula's paranoid accusations of conspiracy became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Soon after his death, Claudius was proclaimed emperor in his place. However, here's where Roman history can get a little distorted and unclear and reveal the underlying political games being played as the empire expanded. For example, what if one of the Roman emperors thought that being possibly the worst human being ever to exist wasn't actually all that bad? We are, of course, talking about Nero, another man widely regarded as a stain on the imperial throne of Rome. Known in popular history for playing the fiddle while Rome burned, Nero had actually done quite a lot besides that to piss the Roman population off. According to historians of the time, he emptied the treasury, leaving the city effectively cash-strapped, murdered anyone who dared question this action of his, or really any other action of his, and generally came across like a bit of an ass. In addition, his biographer Suetonius wrote that Nero practiced every sort of obscenity, including incest, animal cruelty, and flat-out murder. When that's what your own biographer is writing about you, perhaps you've taken a wrong turn in life. Over time, historians have started to suspect that the particulars of the stories about Nero may be untrue. For example, the fiddle story is almost certainly fabricated, seeing as the fiddle wouldn't be invented for almost another millennium. But a raging fire did strike Rome at the time. In the summer of 64 AD, a huge blaze leveled 70% of the city's buildings and made half of its population homeless, as reported by Roman historian Tacitus. The shocked, desperate, and angry Roman population looked for someone to blame, and a rumor quickly spread that the already unpopular Nero had ordered the fire to be set in order to rebuild the city to his liking. His contemporaries thought that this rumor would be quite easily believed. After all, people generally aren't likely to give incestuous, homicidal, puppy-kicking monarchs the benefit of the doubt. The other problem was that while this massive conflagration was devastating the city and its people, Nero decided to make his way up to the top of the city walls, dressed in theatrical garb, and recite a poem about the destruction of Troy, while allegedly weeping with emotion as he imagined the beautiful new city that would arise from the ashes. Legends at the time have him strumming an ancient version of a guitar, known as a chitarra, while reciting his epic poem. As you can imagine, this did nothing to endear him to the people currently running for their lives from their destroyed houses, who had already put up with his BS for several years. However, there is one big problem with all of these accounts. They may be somewhat, or even mostly false. More than that, they may actually be outright propaganda from the time. Part of the problem with relying on historical records about Rome, or really any civilization, is that we have to parse out the biases of the sources. And many modern historians or archaeologists are now questioning if Nero's reputation as one of the most evil rulers of all time is actually deserved. You see, contrary to the popular belief that Nero was disliked by the Roman population, it appears he may have actually been disliked by the elite instead. Unfortunately, Rome elites were the people who mostly shaped how history would be recorded. During his reign, which began when Nero was a very young 17 years old, he enacted tax reforms that pissed off the wealthy but made life significantly better for the lower classes. He also loved games, theater, and entertainment, perhaps why the most infamous story about him has him playing music while reciting a poem, and encouraged such activities amongst the Roman population, organizing events like chariot races. This won him fans among the public, even as it garnered disdain from his fellow wealthy Romans. He also increased the supply of food available to Rome and undertook several important public works projects. In many artworks and coinage of the time, he is depicted as an emperor well-liked by the population at large. So why would the Roman writers, who were Nero's contemporaries, make up so many vicious lies about him? Curator Thorsten Opper of the British Museum points out a simple truth. The sources need to be seen as texts with a clear agenda. Many Roman writers seem to prefer the old days of oligarchical rule in Rome and detested an emperor who seemed to favor the support and wants of the masses instead. Historians have now uncovered evidence that when the fire broke out in Rome, Nero was actually 30 miles away from the city. So not only was it unlikely he was responsible, but he definitely could not have made his way to the top of the city walls and started playing a fiddle or even a chitarra. It's not to say that Nero was a blameless angel. It's very likely he either killed his mother or forced her into ending her life, and he definitely loved partaking in some extravagant spending for himself. However, perhaps painting a depressing picture of the era, neither of these were exactly unheard of acts of monarchs at the time, as killing relatives to secure succession or favor was not all that rare. He also set Christians on fire, blaming them for starting the blaze that burned down Rome. Yet again, though, horrible abuse and mistreatment of Christians was pretty par for the course for Roman emperors overall. So while Nero has been immortalized as an ostentatious, evil, bloodthirsty, unstable, maniacal ruler, the actual problems of his reign and the reason for his eventual downfall seem to have been much more practical and grounded in reality. They also pointed to the issues that would plague the Roman Empire and eventually lead to its collapse. Nero steadily lost the support and favor of Rome's elite over time by prioritizing the Roman people while extravagantly spending tons and tons of money. Simultaneously, he was tasked from the age of 17 with overseeing and holding together a massive, sprawling empire and dealing with the unrest and revolt that ensued after an empire had enslaved several populations. In one corner of the kingdom, Nero faced a fierce revolt led by Queen Boudicca of the Celts, who completely sacked the Roman outpost of Londinium, forcing experienced Roman soldiers to flee in terror before launching a counterattack. In the other corner, the Parthian Empire, located around the region of present-day Iran, was ready to go to war. These events all happened within a few years, testing the endurance and long-term viability of the Roman Empire. More significantly, Nero also started facing dissent from his own supposed subordinates. The governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, known as Gaius Julius Vindex, with a V, unlike the popular cleaning product, rebelled against Nero's rule. He was joined by the Roman governor of Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba, who challenged Nero for his power and position. Though Vindex and his forces lost, which led to Vindex killing himself, more and more politicians threw their support behind Galba, as did those in the Spanish provinces. When the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, who essentially functioned as Nero's head bodyguard, also declared allegiance to Galba, Nero, understandably fearing for his life, fled Rome. With almost no support from the Senate, who had just passed a vote declaring Nero an enemy of Rome, the young emperor realized that his reign, and most likely his life, was coming to an end. In an effort to avoid the humiliation of a public execution, he killed himself at age 30. Since he had no official heir, the Julio-Claudian dynasty that his great-great-grandfather Augustus had implemented ended with Nero's death. As a result, Galba took up the mantle of Roman emperor. Even at this relatively early time, the cracks of the Roman Empire were already beginning to show. Ruling over so many different peoples in far-flung territories and keeping together a massive expanse of land in an age of slow communication and travel was a daunting task, at times seemingly impossible. Couple that with dissatisfied occupied people, local Roman rulers who would sometimes decide to make grabs for power, and general political turmoil, and you have the makings of a beginning of the end. For example, the rule of Galba would be short-lived. The year after Nero's death became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, which, as you might have noticed, is a significantly higher number of monarchs than you'd expect to go through in a year. Though the period did actually last a bit longer, amounting to a little more than a year and a half, the quick changes in leadership indicated nothing particularly productive or good going on in the Roman Empire at the time. Let's zoom in on what exactly happened. The year was 69 AD. It was the worst of times, and that's pretty much it. With the endorsement of the Senate, Galba had started his victory march to Rome. Unfortunately, a word that will continue to pop up in the description of Roman emperors from here on, Galba had already acquired a reputation for greed and cruelty. After just 7 months in office, it became clear to the people of Rome that his reputation was well-deserved. He frequently functioned as a judge, jury, and executioner, sentencing noble Roman men to death due to his own unconfirmed suspicions. He would also seize Roman property on a whim and lean into very paternalistic systems in which those loyal to him were allowed to tax and punish others on the basis of political favors. Corruption flourished under Galba, and Roman citizens started to bristle at this new state of affairs. The masses tried to pressure Galba to punish 2 of his most corrupt lieutenants. In a show of petty defiance and dismissal of the people's will, reminiscent of a stubborn 4-year-old, Galba promoted them instead. Most infuriatingly and stupidly for his own preservation, Galba refused to pay the Roman legions the salary they were owed. Now, we're far from political experts, but refusing to pay your armies seems like a great way to encourage a coup. After months of ill treatment and no pay, while simultaneously seeing Galba flaunt his corruption and cruelty, the legions in Lower Germany decided that enough was enough, and they proclaimed their own general, Aulus Vitellius, emperor. In a show of solidarity with this new development, the Praetorian Guard murdered Galba in the Roman Forum on January 15th. This marks the second time that the Roman emperor's bodyguards presented more of a threat than protection for the ruler of Rome. It would be far from the last. Galba's body was left in the street after his assassination. To understand how disrespected he was by the time of his death, he lay there for a while until a soldier walked by, recognized who it was, and beheaded him to deliver his head to Marcus Salvius Otho. Who, you might ask, is Marcus Salvius Otho? And why didn't any Romans have simpler names? Though we're unsure of the answer to the second question, the first answer is the soon-to-be second emperor of the Year of Four Emperors. If you were paying attention earlier in the video, you might have recognized a small problem with Otho becoming the second emperor of the year. The generous Aulus Vitellius of the Germans had already been proclaimed emperor by his legions. And as the Roman Empire, like most empires, functions under Highlander rules, there could only be one. So, what's Otho's story? Otho had started as a supporter of Galba but gradually distanced himself as he saw Galba's support wane and his behavior worsen. After Galba was killed, the Senate proclaimed Otho emperor. Seemingly a relatively peaceful and good man, Otho tried to reason with Vitellius and his legions as they marched toward Rome and agreed on a peace settlement. However, Vitellius had no interest in peace, nor did he give up his bid for the title of emperor. Otho realized that he'd have to meet the incoming general with military force and sent his troops out to meet those from Lower Germania. Though his legions initially won some victories, they suffered a brutal defeat at the Battle of Bedriacum. Historical accounts may not be totally reliable, as you've seen so far, but Roman historian and senator Cassius Dio wrote that 40,000 Romans died on the battlefield that day. No matter what the exact number was, it is clear that the Roman losses were devastating. At the time, Otho himself was in Brixellum. A messenger from the bloody battle flew in at top speed to deliver the news, which was so shocking that Otho and his companions didn't even believe it at first. The messenger, clearly fiercely committed to getting this important news across to the temporary emperor, threw himself on his sword to emphasize the seriousness of what he was saying. I don't know, but we're sure there are better ways to emphasize your points in an argument, but people during the Roman Empire seem to frequently resort to self-destruction as a matter of first resort. Now, convinced of the seriousness of his losses, Otho decided he would end his resistance then and there. Though historians believe he might have actually won if he had continued fighting Vitellius's legions, it was clear that Otho thought the cost would be too great. Supposedly, he stated that he would no longer endanger the lives of such brave men who had deserved so well. And then, you guessed it, he killed himself. His loyal soldiers plunged into despair, considering Otho one of the bravest men that they had ever met and an incomparable emperor. It's sad to say that in total, Otho's rule lasted only 3 months, a real shame since, if given the chance, he would have made a pretty empathetic and perhaps great emperor. However, that was not to be. Finally, Vitellius was on the scene, and the Senate, eager to align themselves with whoever had the biggest army and was banging down their door, officially endorsed him as the newest emperor of Rome. How would he do? Well, pretty terribly. Unfortunately, before he even got to the city, Vitellius started acting like a greedy warlord instead of one of the leaders of the greatest empires the world had ever known at the time. He gave his troops free rein to intimidate and harass the locals, ask for, but more accurately plunder everything they wanted from villages that they passed through in the countryside of Gaul, and generally acted like a narcissistic despot. Even his pirate-like soldiers shuddered at Vitellius's actions during the infamous Battle of Bedriacum. They viewed the general's absolute slaughter of thousands of Roman troops as unnecessary and inhumane. Vitellius, on the other hand, apparently had no problem with the endless rotting corpses strewn before him on the battlefield. He was said to exclaim, "The odor of a dead enemy was sweet, and that of a fellow citizen sweeter still." You may recognize those words as the words of a sociopath. Soon enough, Vitellius made it clear that he had no respect for Roman rule or tradition. He declared himself above it all, gave himself supreme power, and behaved in a completely tyrannical way, with frequent and pointless executions. Unfortunately, as long as he kept his legion's loyalty, he remained in power. Fortunately for Roman citizens who wished to remain alive and unexecuted, he only managed to do this for 8 months. Soon enough, tired of Vitellius's cruel excesses, another Roman legion commander decided to challenge him for the throne. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, better known as Vespasian, was leading Roman legions in Judea to suppress a Jewish revolt, while Vitellius was losing supporters left and right. Vespasian's legions and those of Syria and Alexandria declared him emperor and swore to fight for him. More legions, including Moesia, Pannonia, Illyricum, and Danube, soon followed. The combination of all those different Roman troops amounted to a formidable force, and Vespasian ended up sailing back to Rome with a massive army behind him. The legions under Vespasian were led by Antonius Primus. They easily crossed and took over northern Italy before they encountered Vitellius's legions in October. Perhaps fittingly, the fight once again took place at Bedriacum, making it the second Battle of Bedriacum. Men on both sides fought through the day and night, resulting in many losses. As the story goes, a small, seemingly ridiculous understanding ended up guaranteeing victory for Vespasian's forces. One of the legions under Primus had come from Syria, where after years on the ground, the men had picked up some local customs. One of them was saluting the sun at dawn. After fiercely battling through a long and bloody night, and perhaps not with the clearest of minds, Vitellius's forces saw this salute and concluded that Primus's men were in fact saluting incoming reinforcements. Exhausted, badly injured, in a state of disrepair, they fled the battle, with Vespasian's troops pursuing them all the way to Rome. Even after Primus's and Vespasian's troops entered the city in December, Vitellius's legion still tried to mount a last-ditch effort. They trapped the incoming men in the winding streets of the Roman capital and threw objects, including tiles from the surrounding rooftops, to kill them. Though many men died as a result of the violence within the city walls, 50,000 according to Cassius Dio, who was apparently spending that particular year as Rome's unofficial body counter, in the end, resistance was futile. Realizing that his time had come, Vitellius tried to escape the city disguised in rags, but Vespasian's men recognized and captured him immediately. They dragged him along the sacred way and displayed him in a show of public humiliation at the Forum, where a crowd hurled abuse at him. The legions then tortured him on the stairs of wailing, which is a thing that apparently needed to exist at the time, and after dragging him through the streets of Rome yet again, this time with a hook instead of a noose like the first time, for a bit of variety, they threw him into the river, but not before severing his head, which they then paraded through the city. We cannot emphasize enough how much the Romans really hated Vitellius, and how becoming a Roman emperor was apparently becoming more of a life shortener than smoking Marlboro Reds. On December 22, 69 AD, the Senate finally declared Vespasian emperor. This would signify the end of a protracted period of Roman turmoil and the beginning of a new, more powerful and prosperous era of imperial Rome known as the Flavian dynasty. Under Vespasian's rule, the Colosseum was constructed, unaware as of yet of the throngs of tourists that would one day stampede through its walls, shouting, "Are you not entertained?" at their exhausted families. Vespasian was an intelligent ruler and a good politician, making sure to restore not only the rule of law that Vitellius had completely disregarded, but also to take care of both the people of Rome and its elite class. He fully restored the power of the Senate and enacted several reforms focused on public welfare. As well regarded as the Flavian dynasty was, the year of 4 emperors troubled many Romans. It reminded them that despite the golden age Augustus had presided over as the first emperor of Rome, there was still a fundamental problem with empires and monarchies, namely, that the welfare and safety of the population often depended on the mental stability and the character of whoever's in charge. And if you're dealt a bad hand, that's it for life, or until assassination. Augustus had managed to claim and consolidate power thanks to the internal failures of the Roman Republic, and he had held on to it because of his shrewd political moves and the care he took of his people. Subsequent emperors had already started to disappoint the Roman public, and more upheavals would soon come. However, for the time being, as long as Rome continued to expand and conquer new lands, the empire's star was still rising. The Roman legions were a big reason for the Roman expansion and overall success. Known for their incredible discipline, the armies of the Roman Republic moved away from the classic formation of their neighboring civilization, the Greek phalanx. The phalanx proved unwieldy for battle, due to the landscape of most of central Italy, consisting of endless hills and valleys. Instead, the Roman legions were composed of relatively small infantry units, known as maniples. Each maniple had 120 men in 12 files and 10 ranks. At times of battle, maniples were arranged in 3 lines of 10 in a checkerboard pattern. That way, the lines were flexible, and the first line could fall back into a defensive formation with the second line if required, or alternatively, the second line could reinforce the first. Gradually, a new, larger unit known as a cohort replaced the maniple. Each had around 360 men, and around the time of Julius Caesar, every legion would have around 10 cohorts, 4 in the front, followed by 2 lines of 3 cohorts each. While this added up to 3,600 men, this only included the heavily armed infantry. The cohorts usually had supporting forces of light infantry and cavalry, bringing the total number of each legion up to around 6,000 men. To put a visual on these large numbers, when 7 legions would go into battle, a not uncommon occurrence, there would be about 25,000 heavily armed infantry stretched out over 1.5 miles. That's a length of just over 26 football fields. An interesting change occurred when the tide of war shifted, and Rome eventually found itself on the defensive side, protecting against invasions rather than invading others to conquer their land. Cohorts were increased to 500 to 600 men each, meaning each legion now had around 5,000 to 6,000 heavily armed infantry troops alone, with cavalry and light infantry composed of archers, slingers, and javelin men functioning as a backup. When the Roman legions started encountering barbarian armies mounted on horseback, they increased the proportion of cavalry to counter these new mounted troops. Thus, cavalry went from 1/7 of an average legion to 1/4. In the 4th century AD, The Romans instituted catapults and ballistas as part of their legions to enhance their defensive capabilities. In addition to the Roman army's unique formation and strict discipline, the legion's weapons provided another big advantage in battle. The pilum and gladius were two of the most popular weapons for infantry soldiers at the time. The pilum was a javelin measuring 7 feet or just over 2 meters, and the gladius was a type of sword about 20 inches or 50 centimeters long. These weapons enabled Roman soldiers to excel in hand-to-hand combat and fighting at a distance with javelins. In addition, the Romans had strong defensive equipment that helped protect them in battles. Items like metal helmets, shields, and cuirasses, or breastplates and backplates fastened together and meant to protect the torso, reduced the amount of damage Roman soldiers took to the head and body. Roman technological advancements helped not only on the battlefield but also in the development of civilization itself. One of the major contributions of the Roman Empire to the world, for example, was the rapid development of engineering practices. Even today, ancient Roman aquifers still survive in parts of Italy and the former Roman territories. The Romans built sophisticated underground sewage systems, enabling not only a primitive form of plumbing to exist, but also improving their city's general hygiene and cleanliness, as waste flowed underground instead of being left on the streets. Part of what enabled Roman engineering marvels was the development of cement and concrete as building materials. The combination of such materials created structures that have stood the test of time, which is part of the reason for the prevalence of Roman ruins throughout the modern world today. By far one of the best achievements of the Romans, and one that helped not only their military expeditions, but also the impressive development of their trade routes, was the Roman road system. Two of the most famous roads, Via Appia and Via Egnatia, enabled the exchange between Rome and Brindisi and Rome and Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, not Constantinople. You can still find remnants of the Appian Way in Italy today, and Ignatia Odos, translated from Greek as Ignatia Street, still runs through the major Greek city of Thessaloniki. As the Roman Empire grew, this extensive road system helped keep the disparate parts of this grand civilization connected. This helped to maintain the precariously large Roman Empire, as did the taxation system. You see, when Rome conquered a new territory, a lot of the residents of the region would become Roman citizens and would be taxed as such. In addition to newly obtained local resources, this increase in the tax base helped grow the empire's wealth. At its peak in 117 AD, the Roman Empire encompassed a lot of the northern African coast, Asia Minor, and most of Europe. This meant that the lands of Rome stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates River, with the northernmost borders of the empire found in Britain. However, the seeds of Rome's undoing had already been planted. The precariousness of the imperial throne, the reliance on imperial conquests for wealth and forced labor, the challenges associated with ruling such a massive area, as well as the class divisions that had pestered Rome since the beginning. All of these factors started to combine into a toxic mix. With the Roman Empire stretched so wide, it was also stretched incredibly thinly. No matter how well the Roman road systems worked, there were no 747s in operation or Zoom meetings to enable oversight of such a large empire. Once Roman expansion stopped, in some cases because they had literally reached the end of a landmass, two major problems materialized. First off, Rome had always relied on its militaristic expansion to enslave a portion of the newly conquered population, and they used forced labor to maintain infrastructure, build the empire's engineering marvels, produce food, and just generally keep the system running. Once the empire became overextended and new conquests ground to a halt, the incoming supply of enslaved labor was halted as well. Though this was undoubtedly good news to all the neighbors of the Roman Empire who wished to remain free, i.e. everyone, it started an era of declining labor force in Rome. Second, the acquisition of new territories and a new tax base from the conquered people, who became citizens instead of slaves, continuously imparted wealth into the Roman Empire. Without the acquisition of new wealth, the Roman economy started to stagnate. Even worse, the heavily armed, formidable Roman legions still had to be funded during the period, as even though they weren't actively fighting to conquer neighboring lands, they still had their hands full, defending the empire from revolts and neighboring invasions. That meant that the army required increasing resources in its valiant attempt to hold Rome's borders together while avoiding acquiring more wealth and land. Defensive spending, coupled with no economic growth, created a further problem. Funds had to be diverted away from the empire's other needs and into the military. Rome's military overspending in its waning years were not only to soldiers but also to engineering feats, like Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain, meant to keep potential invaders away and alleviate some of the pressure on Roman soldiers to defend the border. However, this meant that maintaining the complex, advanced infrastructure built within Rome became a secondary goal, and the empire's irrigation, sewage, and road system started to slide into disrepair. This decreased both the quality of life for the average Roman citizen, as well as their trust and pride in the emperor and the Senate, as it was clear that citizens' needs were not being prioritized. Some scholars argued that the Roman emperors of the time period had to extract more and more taxes from the population to fund the army. This actually led to fewer people being able to pay the taxes, eventually wiping out the middle class, while the rich moved their homes outside of the city and sought to evade taxes. There's significant debate about how much this actually affected the Roman economy of the time. However, much evidence suggests that coin hoarding became common throughout the empire in this era to help avoid taxes. Meanwhile, a political system that had started to rely on ascension via homicide was also becoming problematic. As the empire grew, becoming emperor of Rome almost guaranteed a shortened lifespan. The crisis of the 3rd century started in 235 AD, and it was exactly as fun as it sounds for everyone involved. The emperor at the time, Severus Alexander, had ascended to the throne at 14 years old. Despite that, his reign had been peaceful and a prosperous one overall. However, he was very ill-suited for battle. Unfortunately for him, Rome's neighbors were starting to poke at the empire's borders. Starting in 231 AD, the Sasanian Empire invaded Roman lands, followed by numerous invasions by the neighboring Germanic tribes between 234 and 235 AD. As empathetic and conscientious a ruler as Severus was, he was an incredibly inept general. His troops started to resent him, and their military discipline fell apart. Eventually, in March of 235 AD, Maximinus Thrax, along with his legion, mutinied and assassinated Severus Alexander. Naturally, according to the rules of the time, that made him the next emperor. On a side note, we don't recommend this method for acquiring any job of your dreams. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Maximinus would not go on to have a long and prosperous reign. Instead, his ascension started the crisis, almost 50 years of utter anarchy, in which military leaders fought and killed each other to ascend to the throne. Rulers died under mysterious circumstances. Disease, revolts, and fires plagued the land. Persecution of Christians also ran rampant during this time. More than 25 men took power during this period, almost all of them dying by assassination. Worse yet, the people tasked with protecting the Roman emperors, the Praetorian Guard, were actually the murderers most of the time. Without stable and peaceful leadership, corruption ran rampant throughout Rome, including in its Senate, and civic participation and pride failed miserably. Things got so bad that one time the Praetorian Guard assassinated a Roman emperor and named the next one based on the highest bidder. Some rulers' reigns only lasted for a few days or weeks, though the exact time span of some of the reigns is uncertain. It appears the record for the shortest reign goes to the father and son team of Gordian I and Gordian II. The pair revolted against Maximinus in April of 238 AD and were recognized by the Senate. A whole 22 days later, Gordian II was killed by legions loyal to Maximinus, and Gordian I, who was the ripe old age of 80, killed himself as soon as he heard the news. 1 month later, Maximinus himself was killed by his own men, so defeating the Gordians ended up being a bit of a Pyrrhic victory after all. The era of imperial crisis ended in 285 AD and was followed by the Tetrarchy. Diocletian, the emperor of the time, initiated a split of the Roman Empire into the western and eastern sections. Splitting the empire was an attempt to make this large bureaucracy more manageable, with Diocletian appointing junior rulers, resulting in 4 separate rulers functioning all at once, which is what gave this period the name Tetrarchy. 2 Caesars ruled the Roman Empire under 2 Augusti because Romans liked using names of former rulers as formal titles in order to confuse future history students. Diocletian theoretically co-ruled with Maximian, a military colleague he appointed Caesar in 285 AD, though in practice, Maximian always functioned as a subordinate. Perhaps since he had come from humble origins, he felt he owed Diocletian a favor and should follow his rules. Then in 305 AD, Diocletian did something quite rare for a Roman Empire. He let go of the throne without being assassinated or just dying. Feeling increasingly weak and overwhelmed, he gave an emotional speech in which he explained that the empire should be ruled by someone stronger than him. As Maximian worked for Diocletian for all intents and purposes, this meant he had to abdicate as well. However, instead of a peaceful transfer of power ushering in a new era of prosperity, it instead plunged the empire into civil war. One man known as the future Emperor Constantine finally emerged victorious in 312 AD. He killed his co-emperor Maxentius at Milvian Bridge, and once again, the Western Roman Empire had one and only one ruler. Wanting to lead the entire Roman Empire once more, Constantine also defeated the Eastern ruler and ended up ruling over a united empire. However, he acknowledged the slight separation that had formed between the empire's two geographical segments by establishing the capital of Constantinople, named after himself, in the east. Constantine is also famous for being the first Roman emperor to establish Christianity as the empire's official religion, as opposed to former rulers who had persecuted this, at the time, new wave religion. Even Diocletian and Maximian had ordered the closing of churches and the burning of Christian scriptures just a few years before. Constantine ruled until 337 AD, when he died of natural causes. After his death, the running of the empire was handed over to his three sons, the unimaginatively named Constantine II, Constans I, and Constantius II. Once again, power struggles emerged with the three rulers at the helm. Constantine II and Constans I fought a vicious war for power, which resulted in Constantine II's death. Constans I's victory was short-lived, as the Roman legion soon declared a military man named Magnentius as the emperor, who promptly killed Constans I. Just 3.5 years later, Magnentius killed himself after losing a battle, thus allowing Constantius II, the sole remaining son of Constantine, who had been ruler of the East during Magnentius's rise to power in Rome, to take full control. Then a fever in 361 AD came and wiped Constantius II out as well. The next man to ascend to the throne, Julian, was a cousin of Constantius II. He ruled for only 2 short years before succumbing to injuries during a battle against Persia. However, he remains known to this day for being the last emperor to rule over a pagan Rome, as he decided to reverse the empire's stance on Christianity. After Julian's death in 363 AD came the Valentinian dynasty, marked by power struggles, usurpations, assassinations, and overall turmoil. Eventually, Theodosius I, who had started in 379 AD as an emperor of the East, ruled over a united Roman Empire once again after the death of Valentinian II, the Western ruler, in 392 AD. However, this united Roman Empire would be short-lived. Theodosius I died just a few years later in 395 AD. This marked the final split of Rome between Theodosius's sons, Arcadius and Honorius, after the area had been split and resplit several times over the last few decades. The final division lay between the East, ruled by Arcadius, which would become the Byzantine Empire, and the West, ruled by Honorius, which would become, well, nothing at all pretty soon after. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to thrive while the West quickly crumbled. In fact, the prosperity of the East may have hastened the collapse of the West. Though the two smaller areas could theoretically be managed more easily now, they also had to coordinate military funding and resource allocation, which they failed to do spectacularly. When outside forces like the Germanic tribes threatened the empire, the two sides could not cooperate well enough to swiftly take action. Over time, the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire grew in wealth, while the Latin-speaking West experienced an exacerbated economic crisis. Constantine and subsequent emperors of the East had made sure to fortify the city well and keep legions stationed around its wall. The Byzantine Empire's wealth helped shore up those fortifications. Nearby invaders, seeing Constantinople's power and strength as opposed to Rome's weakness and ruin, became more likely to attack the West for an easier victory. In contrast, the Eternal City, the place that had once stood as a symbol of the mighty Roman Empire's power, was falling apart internally and physically as its infrastructure crumbled. But what happened to the formidable and well-armed Roman legions? How could the empire have crumbled so quickly while these impressive soldiers were out there defending Roman lands? Well, in later years, such as during the reigns of the emperors Diocletian and Constantine, the increasing challenge of keeping the Roman legions well-funded and able to fend off revolts and outside attacks created the need for mercenaries. Emperors would recruit soldiers from various neighboring factions, including the Germanic Goths. A strange arrangement, as they had frequently fought with them in the past. However, it was clear that desperate times called for desperate measures. The Goths fought well enough, but the problem was they didn't have any particular reason to be loyal to Rome. They were, as most mercenaries, just in it for the money. In fact, some of them became very resentful toward the Roman Empire, and for justifiable reasons. When one of the biggest invasions to date occurred in the area, the rampage of the Huns across northern Europe in the late 4th century, Many Germanic tribes fled south into the Roman Empire. Otherwise, they faced potential slaughter by the Huns. On the other hand, they ended up dealing with harassment and flat-out abuse in Rome, a real between a rock and a hard place situation. Though tribes like the Visigoths were allowed to cross the Danube into Roman territory, the Romans made it clear that they would barely be tolerated within the empire's borders. Historian Ammianus Marcellinus notes that while the Visigoths were starving, Roman officials would give them dog meat, but sometimes only in exchange for forcing the Visigoth children into slavery. The Roman treatment of the Goths became too cruel to bear, and eventually a fierce revolt occurred, ending in the obliteration of a Roman army in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, and the murder of Eastern Emperor Valens. The fact that Goths were also serving in the Roman army at this point probably did not help the Roman legions win any victories, as it's unlikely they would have stayed to fight against their brothers. Genuinely perplexed as to why the people they had fed dog meat to in exchange for making their children slaves held such resentment against them, the Romans scrambled to negotiate a truce. However, by 410 the Goths were over any idea of peace, and the Goth king Alaric, a great name for a no doubt terrible band, had had enough. He marched west and sacked the city of Rome with the help of several Goth soldiers who had spent time serving in the Roman army and learning all their techniques and formations. Though the empire would hold on for a little bit longer, it was nothing more than a dying gasp. Neighboring Goths, the European tribes, not the Marilyn Manson fans, repeatedly attacked the empire until one of the tribes, the Vandals, burned it all to the ground in 455 AD. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had crumbled. Perhaps fittingly, the very last emperor of Rome was named Romulus, an echo of the very first emperor of Rome. After being defeated by a Germanic general named Odoacer, he was thrown out but allowed to live out the rest of his life in exile, going out like the rest of the Western Roman Empire, not with a bang but a whimper. Flames consume the building, and the sound of screaming inside almost drowns out the gunshots. Women and children cower in horror as black smoke fills their lungs and the walls around them begin to crumble from the heat. It's a nightmare, hell on earth, unfolding in the previously peaceful city of Waco, as surrounding men in black sunglasses dispassionately stare on. Decades earlier, a black man stands on a hotel balcony in Memphis, getting fresh air and talking to a friend, when a bullet fired by an assassin wielding a Remington Model 760 pierces the man's cheek. He slumps over, not long for this world, as the people around him panic and scream. The man's name is Martin Luther King Jr. These events are separated by space and time, but in the minds of many Americans, they're connected. More specifically, they're connected by a question: can we really trust the FBI? The Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States has a storied and highly contentious history. They famously took down notorious criminals like John Dillinger. They arrested Nazi spies, but they also targeted civil rights leaders, played a massive role in the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and in some cases, were actively responsible for civilian deaths. To many people on various sides of the political aisle, the Bureau simply cannot be trusted. Today, we're taking an in-depth look at some of the specific reasons why that is. One particularly infamous event that damaged the FBI's reputation in the minds of many was the 1993 siege between FBI agents and members of the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians began as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists started in 1930 by Victor Houtef. Houtef preached that the Messiah in the book of Isaiah was not Jesus, but had in fact not arrived yet. He purchased a compound in Waco, Texas that he named Mount Carmel, and the Branch Davidians formed a community there, believing that they would be the center of the new world after the biblical apocalypse. In 1981, a man named Vernon Howell joined the Branch Davidians. As he accumulated power within the group, he changed his name to David Koresh and eventually took over as the group's leader. He told the members that he was a Messiah and that his followers needed to prepare themselves for Armageddon and a coming holy war. He engaged in various acts of sexual abuse and misconduct in his community. But as horrific as his behavior was, that was not what would eventually lead to the siege at Waco. Koresh and the Branch Davidians attracted the attention of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, as well as the FBI, as evidence surfaced that he was illegally stockpiling firearms at the Mount Carmel compound. On February 18, 1993, ATF attempted to raid the compound in order to execute a search warrant. The events that followed have been the subject of debate, as Branch Davidians and ATF agents each claim that the others opened fire first. But either way, the end result was a firefight that killed 5 ATF agents and 5 Branch Davidians. After the deaths of the 5 federal agents, the FBI took command of the operation, and a standoff began that would last for 51 days. Malcolm Gladwell described the operation in his coverage for The New Yorker. Outside the Mount Carmel complex, the FBI assembled what has been called probably the largest military force ever gathered against a civilian suspect in American history. 10 Bradley tanks, 2 Abrams tanks, 4 combat engineering vehicles, 668 agents in addition to 6 U.S. Customs officers, 15 U.S. Army personnel, 13 members of the Texas National Guard, 31 Texas Rangers, 131 officers from the Texas Department of Public Safety, 17 from the McLennan County Sheriff's Office, and 18 Waco Police, for a total of 899 people. After negotiating with Koresh, the FBI was able to secure the release of 19 children from the compound in exchange for Koresh being allowed to broadcast a message on the radio. However, that left 98 people in the building. The FBI sent a video camera inside, and Koresh and his followers made a video introducing themselves and giving statements. This was sent to the FBI on March 8th and was intended to demonstrate that the people inside were not hostages, but were of their own free will. Koresh attempted to ask for more time, insisting he must finish writing religious documents before surrendering. All the while, a steadily widening divide was forming among the FBI agents. Some believed that the negotiation was the way forward. Others advocated for a show of force against the Branch Davidians and Koresh. The FBI cut all water and power to the compound, forcing those inside to rely on rainwater and MRE rations to survive. 11 more people were ordered to leave by Koresh and left the compound. On April 14th, Koresh issued a letter to his lawyer, which was his last communication with the outside world. He claimed to be working to complete his final piece of writing and that he would surrender as soon as it was finished and copies were given out. However, the FBI did not believe this to be true, and on April 19th, they raided the compound. Agents called the compound, warning those inside to take cover. The Branch Davidian who answered the phone would not speak to them, instead throwing the phone and the phone line out the door of the compound. The FBI hostage rescue team deployed 2 armored CEVs to the compound buildings and began to pump tear gas into the compound. The FBI negotiator expected the tear gas to drive people out, but they still remained inside. CEV-1 breached the building and began to fire tear gas again as Branch Davidians fired their weapons at the armored vehicle. At this point, the hostage rescue team was authorized to fire military tear gas rounds into an underground bunker. Meanwhile, CEV-2 broke into the second floor of the compound with a battering ram. At 12:07, flames were spotted in the building. The fire quickly spread, with high winds and openings in the structure created by the FBI contributing to the fire. The building burnt quickly, followed by an explosion on the left side of the compound and the collapse of the roof. The fire began to burn out at 12:55, and the entire compound was in ruins. Of the 85 Branch Davidians left in the building at the time of the fire, 76 people, including Koresh and many of the children still inside, were killed in the process. It was a horrific tragedy that left Americans unsure about who to blame. President Bill Clinton said, "I do not think that the United States government is responsible for the fact that a bunch of religious fanatics decided to kill themselves." Others disagreed, particularly given the fact that the exact source of the fire had not been identified. The events in Waco were as controversial as they were newsworthy, drawing a great deal of scrutiny. Some surviving Branch Davidians, as well as family members of those who died in the standoff, filed suits against the United States government. The case was rejected, with the court citing evidence that the Branch Davidians fired first. The controversies didn't end there. From 1993 to 1999, the FBI denied the use of pyrotechnic devices during the siege. However, pyrotechnic gas grenades were found at the scene. In 1999, the FBI spokespeople amended their statement, saying that the grenades had been used but not fired into the building and had not been responsible for the fire. This change in the official story only made the Bureau look more suspicious to those expressing mistrust toward them. The events at Waco have continued to be scrutinized for decades. 10 years after Waco, sociologist Stuart A. Wright wrote about the siege in Nova Religio, stating, "There is no greater example of misfeasance than the failure of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to bring about a bloodless resolution to the 51-day standoff." In the years since Waco, veteran FBI agents have also weighed in on the failures of the Bureau's response. Gary Nosner, the agent who oversaw the negotiations during the first half of the siege, has expressed concerns surrounding the Bureau's tactics. For example, in early March, the team cut power to the compound, threw flashbangs at members of the Branch Davidians, mooned them, and played loud noises to keep them awake at night that included monks chanting, "These boots are made for walking" by Nancy Sinatra on repeat, and the screams of rabbits being slaughtered. To make matters worse, after the FBI successfully got 7 members to exit the compound, the forces outside bulldozed the group's vehicles with tanks. This resulted in Koresh issuing the statement, "No one is coming out, nobody." In Nosner's words, this approach doomed the effort to resolve the situation, stating, "You know Pavlov? You can't train your dog to bring in the newspaper, so kick the dog and expect him to bring you the paper again." He believes that if the FBI had refined its strategy, we might have gotten everybody out. In spite of his criticisms, Nosner was one of the negotiators who unanimously signed off on the use of tear gas on the compound building. For many FBI agents, this tragedy seemed inevitable. Byron Sage, the lead FBI negotiator during the siege, told the Austin American-Statesman, "The biggest problem we had was internal. We brought it on ourselves. We created a crisis within a crisis." He attributed the disastrous outcome of the siege partially to the lack of communication between the negotiators, the hostage rescue team, and the SWAT teams on the ground. Because there was a breakdown in communication, the negotiators' words and the tactical team's actions did not align, causing tensions to rise and possibly strengthening the Branch Davidians in their resolve to stay put. Though he does not believe Koresh would have ever surrendered peacefully, hindsight has made the flaws in the FBI's approach to the crisis obvious. In the aftermath of Waco, the ATF invested in tactical equipment and new weapons, as well as tear gas and automatic weapons training. Agents also trained with the Los Angeles Police Department via the National Tactical Officers Association, with a specialization in hostage rescue, warrant execution, and again tear gas. Meanwhile, the FBI also implemented changes. The Bureau created the Critical Incident Response Group and reworked training so that tactical and negotiation teams could train, work, and live together. Though the FBI attempted to change its approach to potentially prevent similar failures in the future, the damage to its reputation was already done. For many, this proved that the FBI could not be trusted and was an active threat to the American people. This belief was especially strong among right-wing fringe groups who had already begun to hold an anti-FBI position after the 1992 standoff at Ruby Ridge. The events at Ruby Ridge were set in motion when a man named Randy Weaver was caught selling 2 sawed-off shotguns to an undercover agent. In 1991, he was arrested by federal agents for making and possessing illegal weapons. He was released on bond but never appeared for his court date. Instead, he took his wife, 2 daughters, and son and retreated to their home on Ruby Ridge, one of the most remote places in the state of Idaho. They holed up in the cabin there until U.S. Marshals closed in, resulting in a firefight between the Marshals, Weaver, and his 14-year-old son. A U.S. Marshal and Weaver's son were killed in the process, and an 11-day standoff began. During the standoff, an FBI sniper who was attempting to take out Weaver and his friend shot and killed Weaver's wife, who was holding their infant child at the time. The standoff ended when Weaver and his friend Harris surrendered and were taken into custody. The deaths of Weaver's wife and son drew outrage toward the FBI, blaming them for the loss of innocent lives. When Waco occurred the following year, it only radicalized those with anti-government leanings even further. One of the people radicalized by the events at Ruby Ridge and Waco was the Oklahoma City bomber himself, Timothy McVeigh. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh, who had witnessed some of the events at Waco with his own eyes, bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma. It was the 2nd anniversary of the end of the Waco siege. He later told federal investigators that the bombing was planned as an act of retaliation for Waco. While people were horrified by the Oklahoma attack, they were also newly enraged about Waco and Ruby Ridge. Author Bridget Lebens-Nakos noted that immediately after the bombing, nearly 3 in 4 Americans approved of the actions of the FBI at Waco. 3 months later, however, 2 in 4 Americans disapproved. It was not an endorsement of McVeigh by any means, but a conversation had been sparked, and criticisms of the FBI had been raised, and the genie could not be put back in the proverbial bottle. To this day, civilian militias reference Waco and Ruby Ridge as evidence that the federal government is an active threat to civilian life and that standing up to that threat can be deadly. While the FBI's actions at Waco and Ruby Ridge fanned the flames of rage and anti-government sentiment on the fringes of the far right, the FBI also targeted left-wing and progressive groups in a series of covert projects from between 1956 and 1971, now referred to as COINTELPRO. In 1956, the United States government was becoming increasingly concerned about the influence of communism and the ideology's presence on American soil. As the Cold War waged on, many U.S. government organizations could feel the Soviet Union nipping at their heels and were desperate to stamp out its influence. So COINTELPRO began with the goal of countering the Communist Party in the U.S. But it didn't stop there. Targeted organizations quickly expanded to include groups protesting the Vietnam War, the Socialist Workers' Party, organizations affiliated with the Women's Liberation Movement, and the Black Panther Party. It also included groups like the Ku Klux Klan, all lumped together with civil rights groups. The standard tactics of COINTELPRO included wiretaps, anonymous letters intended to sow dissent and division, embedded informants, IRS audits, and the creation of documents that would, in the Bureau's words, foster factionalism and bring certain individuals into disrepute before the American public. One of these individuals that COINTELPRO set out to specifically target was none other than the pioneering civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Following King's iconic I Have a Dream speech in 1963, COINTELPRO's assistant director William C. Sullivan responded to pressure from J. Edgar Hoover to target King. He wrote, "In the light of King's powerful demagogic speech, we must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous racial slur of the future in this nation, from the standpoint of communism, the racial slur, and national security." From there, the FBI began to bug King's home and hotel rooms, placing a total of 8 wiretaps and 16 bugs. This was accompanied by IRS harassment, statements from Hoover referring to King as a notorious liar, and 2 days after King was announced as the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, a particularly damning package. The Bureau sent King a compilation tape of recordings of King, including evidence of his affairs. Along with the tape, they included an anonymous letter that called him a filthy, abnormal beast and threatened to release the tape to the public if he did not take his own life. When he refused to acquiesce, FBI Associate Director Cartha D. DeLoach offered to send the surveillance transcript to a variety of news outlets, including Newsweek and Newsday. They also focused their attention on Malcolm X, where they worked to widen the rift between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, contributing to the disputes that ultimately led to his 1965 murder. As writers like Gregory Kane at the Baltimore Sun put it, FBI should acknowledge complicity in the assassination of Malcolm X. In 1967, the FBI launched COINTELPRO Black Hate, which focused primarily on King and the SCLC, as well as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Deacons for Defense and Justice, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Nation of Islam. It established the Ghetto Informant Program, which used thousands of pieces of information from 1967 to 1973 to collect information for the Bureau on civil unrest in the black community. An FBI memo from March 1968 elaborated on the goals of the program. An excerpt includes Goals: 1. Prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. An effective coalition of black nationalist groups might be the first step toward a real Mau Mau in America. 2. Prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. King could be a very real contender for this position. Another group targeted by the FBI and COINTELPRO was the Black Panther Party. First founded in 1966 with the goal of ending police brutality in Oakland, the Black Panther Party was known for organizing neighborhood police patrols and providing a number of social programs, including free breakfast for school children, which provided local children with free breakfast before school. The program fed thousands of children and helped to provide a positive image of the civil rights group. J. Edgar Hoover saw this as a direct threat, referring to it as potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the BPP and destroy what it stands for. The FBI swiftly launched an all-out war against the free breakfast program. They drafted a fake coloring book under the guise of official Black Panther literature, which was purported to teach anti-white racism. According to historian Franziska Meister, FBI agents in San Francisco told parents that the food at these breakfast programs was infected with venereal diseases. Police officers raided the breakfast program sites in Oakland and Baltimore, and in Chicago, the police took photographs of the children who had shown up to be fed. According to one female Panther who spoke to historian Nick Heinen, the night before the first program in Chicago was to open, the Chicago police broke into the church and mashed up all the food and urinated on it. The FBI didn't stop there either. Between 1967 and 1969, according to the Panthers' attorney, raids and arrests of Panther members cost the party over $200,000, or $1.3 million in today's money, on bail bond premiums alone. Then the FBI focused its attention on Fred Hampton, the Black Panther Party's leader. In 1969, the FBI sent an anonymous letter to the leader of a Chicago street gang called the Blackstone Rangers, claiming that Fred Hampton had taken out a hit on him. According to an internal memo, the FBI intended the letter to disrupt the BPP or lead to reprisals against its leadership, including violent-type activity, shooting, and the like. The attempt to start a firefight between the Panthers and the Rangers was unsuccessful, but Fred Hampton would still meet a tragic end. On December 4, 1969, in the pre-dawn hours of the morning, Chicago police officers raided a Black Panther apartment on the west side of Chicago. They arrived with a search warrant and promptly fired 90 bullets into the apartment with submachine guns, shotguns, a rifle, and a pistol. Originally, they claimed that the Panthers had shot first, but later evidence showed that this was a lie. What the police claimed to be bullet holes from Panther fire were in fact only nail heads. Later analysis of the scene showed that most of the gunfire was aimed at Fred Hampton's bed. Along with fellow Panther leader Mark Clark, Hampton was killed in the assault. He was 21 years old. 4 other Panthers were wounded, and 7 were arrested and charged with attempted murder, though the charges were later dropped. In 2021, FBI memos and reports obtained by historian Aaron Leonard through the Freedom of Information Act and reported on by the Chicago Sun-Times revealed that William C. Sullivan, along with George Moore, the head of the extremist section of the Domestic Intelligence Division, played a part in planning and covering up the raid on the apartment. They personally knew Hampton's bodyguard, William O'Neill, who was working as an FBI informant and who provided the Bureau with a floor plan of Hampton's apartment. The plan was then passed along to the Chicago Police Department, who carried out the deadly raid. By the early 1970s, the combination of financial stress, internal division, and assassinations caused the Black Panther Party to collapse. COINTELPRO remained a secret until March 8, 1971, when the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI field office in Medea, Pennsylvania, and took several official documents that were then sent to several news agencies. Several initially refused to publish the information, but the Washington Post, after verifying the documents were legitimate, published them on the paper's front page. Lawsuits were filed against the FBI by NBC correspondent Carl Stern and the Socialist Workers' Party. Then, in 1976, the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities of the United States Senate, nicknamed the Church Committee after its chairman, Senator Frank Church, began a formal investigation into the FBI and COINTELPRO. The committee's final report stated that the committee finds that the domestic activities of the intelligence community at times violated specific statutory prohibitions and infringed the constitutional rights of American citizens. The legal questions involved in intelligence programs were often not considered. On other occasions, they were intentionally disregarded in the belief that because the program served national security, the law did not apply. While intelligence officers on occasion failed to disclose to their superiors programs that were illegal or of questionable legality, the committee finds that the most serious breaches of duty were those of senior officials who were responsible for controlling intelligence activities and generally failed to assure compliance with the law. Many of the techniques used would be intolerable in a democratic society even if all of the targets had been involved in violent activity. But COINTELPRO went far beyond that. The Bureau conducted a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association, on the theory that preventing the growth of dangerous groups and the propagation of dangerous ideas would protect the national security and deter violence. The committee also stated that while the declared purposes of these programs were to protect the national security or prevent violence, Bureau witnesses admit that many of the targets were nonviolent and most had no connections with a foreign power. Indeed, nonviolent organizations and individuals were targeted because the Bureau believed they represented a potential for violence, and nonviolent citizens who were against the war in Vietnam were targeted because they gave aid and comfort to violent demonstrators by lending respectability to their cause. The imprecision of the targeting is demonstrated by the inability of the Bureau to define the subjects of the programs. The Black Nationalist Program, according to its supervisor, included a great number of organizations that you might not today characterize as a black nationalist, but which were in fact primarily black. Thus, the Nonviolent Southern Christian Leadership Conference was labeled as a black nationalist hate group. This highlights the failings of the program and the FBI as a whole. It should be noted that while COINTELPRO officially ended in April 1971, the Bureau continued to conduct surveillance of various groups, including the American Indian Movement and environmentalist groups such as the Earth Liberation Front. The Intercept reported in 2018, based on documents from November 2014, that the FBI had been tracking the activities of Black Lives Matter activists using informants and physical surveillance techniques. Publications such as the Atlanta Black Star drew the comparison between this surveillance and the COINTELPRO of the civil rights movement. These are far from the only controversies involving the FBI, and the organization seems to be deeply concerned with its reputation. In 2007, a program called Wikiscanner determined that people using FBI computers had edited entries on Wikipedia involving topics such as the Iraq War and Guantanamo Bay. Aerial and satellite images of the prison there were removed from the Wikipedia page on the subject using an FBI computer. It may not be the grandest conspiracy the Bureau has been involved in, but combine small scandals like Wikiscanner with the Bureau's history of cover-ups and spying on civilians, and it's easy to see why there are many people who believe that the FBI cannot be trusted. A deafening explosion radiates from the 12-inch guns as they fire from the deck of an ironclad ship. Sailors scramble across the damp planks to reach their stations and prepare for the next volley. In the distance, an explosion erupts, sending debris and enemy bodies flying through the air as shells hit the shoreline. This isn't a scene from a World War II sea battle, surprisingly. This all happened in 1882 when the HMS Monarch bombarded the shores of Alexandria using turret-mounted big guns to decimate its target, thus ushering in the age of the battleship. Surprisingly, the legacy of these behemoths of iron and firepower was relatively short-lived. Naval confrontations from the early 1900s through World War II were full of battleships firing cannons at one another and decimating anything in their path. So this begs the question, why were battleships only a blip on the timeline of maritime warfare? There are many reasons that battleships were eventually retired, but the main two come down to technology and crew. The fate of retired battleships varied. Some are still in existence today, while others were annihilated in nuclear explosions. Let's go on a voyage to uncover how battleships came to be so powerful, their role in shaping maritime warfare, and their ultimate destiny following World War II. Before we dive into the brief history of battleships, let's clarify what they are. Battleships were heavily armored vessels that displaced large quantities of water. This meant they typically had reinforced hulls and extra plating to withstand being hit by enemy fire. However, the key aspect of battleships that distinguished them from other naval vessels was that their main battery consisted of large-caliber guns. This meant that battleships did not employ missiles, but were instead equipped with huge turrets that could fire shells anywhere from 5 to 16 inches in size. It was these types of guns that determined whether a ship was classified as a battleship or not. The battleship was birthed out of the early ironclad ships of the 19th century. Typically, the French ship Glory is considered to be the first ironclad vessel to sail the seas when it was launched in 1859. The Glory was a 5,630-ton broadside ironclad with a wooden hull that combined sail and steam propulsion to travel. The vessel had 4.7-inch thick armored plates and was equipped with the most advanced cannons of the day. However, this meant that even though the Glory was the first vessel to have a heavily armored hull, it did not have the guns to be considered a battleship. In the United States, armored ships were brought to the forefront of naval military battles when the Civil War ripped the country in two. In 1862, fighting erupted at Hampton Roads, where the James, Nansemond, and Elizabeth Rivers meet near the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. The Union's USS Monitor and the Confederacy's CSS Virginia, also known as the Merrimack, duked it out for naval supremacy. Both of those vessels were ironclad and used steam engines to move through the murky waters of the estuary. The battle itself ended in a draw, but the conflict between the Monitor and Merrimack showed the future of naval warfare would consist of more heavily armored ships with powerful guns. In 1869, a crucial development toward the conception of true battleships occurred. The HMS Monarch became the first ocean-going iron-hulled vessel to have mounted guns. This Goliath of a ship displaced 8,456 tons of water and had 4 12-inch guns in 2 separate revolving turrets on the main deck. The ship was still propelled by sails along with a steam engine, but the mounted turrets were a crucial step forward to what we think of as battleships today. In 1906, a little over 4 decades after the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, the British Royal Navy commissioned the HMS Dreadnought. Many consider this the first modern battleship, as it was heavily armored, no longer employed the use of sails, and had a complement of 5 twin 12-inch guns, 24 3-inch guns, and 4 18-inch torpedo tubes. This type of layout became known as the all-big gun armament. The dreadnought was 527 feet in length and displaced around 18,410 tons of water. It also could reach speeds of more than 20 knots. The HMS Dreadnought would act as a template for the future ships of a similar caliber and would eventually evolve into the battleships of World War II. For a while, all of these types of vessels were called dreadnoughts, but eventually the term battleship became more and more commonly used until it was synonymous with the all-big gun vessels now considered battleships. Between 1906 and the First World War, there were engagements between dreadnought-type ships across European waters. However, it was the Battle of Jutland in 1916 that ushered in the age of the battleship as a main staple of naval warfare. During the conflict, the British Royal Navy and the German Navy engaged one another in the North Sea. The battleships deployed needed to have a line of sight to be effective, as radio communications to coordinate large-scale battle plans were in their infancy, and radar wouldn't be developed as a practical engineering device until 1935. This meant that the heavily armored big gun ships fired upon one another at a relatively close range, causing massive amounts of damage and loss of life. There was no definitive winner in the Battle of Jutland, but it did show that naval technology had made tremendous leaps and bounds over the past several decades, and that any pre-dreadnought ships were all but obsolete. Naval warfare would now be dominated by battleships with heavy armor, big guns, and powerful propulsion. Another huge win for battleships was that while submarines in World War I were deadly to pre-dreadnought vessels, these new floating fortresses were well protected against enemy U-boats by their thick armor. By 1918, battleship numbers were at their peak. 118 dreadnoughts sailed for 13 different navies around the world. After the Great War ended, the Washington Treaty was established in 1922, which limited the size of new battleships being constructed to 35,000 tons. Some historians view the ramping up of battleship production in the post-World War I world as similar to the nuclear arms race of the Cold War. The nation with the biggest, toughest, and most numerous battleships would rule the oceans. At a time when airplanes were still being refined for both long-distance flights and warfare, whoever controlled the oceans controlled the movement of goods, people, and ideologies around the world. Regardless of the limitations the Washington Treaty put in place, nations still continued to improve upon their naval technology and upgrade their battleship designs. It was during this time that the fast battleships started to be developed. These vessels combined the heavy armor and the weapons of the dreadnoughts with speeds of the cruisers, which meant that these new war machines could exceed speeds of 30 knots and unleash an unholy barrage of shells against an enemy. As a new threat arose in Europe with the rise of the Nazi Party, countries completely abandoned the Washington Treaty. Germany began building Bismarck-class ships at 52,600 tons. The United States constructed Iowa-class battleships at 45,000 tons, and Japan followed suit with 2 of their Yamato-class vessels, the largest battleships ever built, at 72,000 tons. Ironically, it was during the time between World War I and World War II, when restrictions on battleship construction were put in place, that the largest and most destructive vessels of this type were constructed. This was also when the usefulness of battleships was still at its peak. Soon after World War II started, the once mighty battleships that dominated the oceans would become bygones of a different era. In hindsight, the battleship really didn't last that long as a main player in naval warfare. However, it was the construction of those war vessels that led to progress being made on many other types of ships. Therefore, the rise of the battleship can be viewed as a catalyst for their demise. In the interim between the world wars, naval powers upgraded from their World War I battleships while simultaneously building new vessels. The World War I-era battleships were fitted with increasingly tall towers, more armor, and anti-aircraft weapons. With these new upgrades and ever larger battleships being built, more and more sailors were needed to operate the vessels. When World War II erupted, battleships were still major threats in naval warfare. In June of 1940, the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were able to launch a surprise attack against the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious and sank it off the coast of Norway. Interestingly, one of the earlier Allied missions that utilized battleships was against themselves. On July 3, 1940, British battleships opened fire on French warships at the naval base of Mers el-Kabir near Oran on the coast of French Algeria. This was done as part of Operation Catapult, to destroy neutral French ships in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Nazis after the Allies were defeated at the Battle of France. The British bombardment from both the air and sea cost the lives of approximately 1,300 French servicemen. However, as the war progressed, the future of the battleship became more and more uncertain. Ships were being built to fulfill multiple roles, some of which were formerly prescribed to battleships. It was one vessel in particular that would bring a new age of naval warfare. The aircraft carriers and the planes launched from them were becoming more efficient at destroying targets, including other ships. Battleships were excellent at damaging or destroying naval vessels and shore targets, but were much less efficient at destroying aircraft. 5 of the 8 battleships stationed at Pearl Harbor were sunk by Japanese aircraft during their surprise attack. The British battleships Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sunk on the way to support ground troops in the invasion of Malaya by Japanese land-based bombers and torpedo aircraft in 1941. These examples are just a subset of the many times the battleships were destroyed or severely damaged by aircraft on both sides of World War II. These air-to-sea interactions would mark the beginning of the end for battleships playing a major role in naval warfare. It's interesting to note that the Schleswig-Holstein, an early pre-dreadnought battleship, fired the first shots of World War II during the bombardment of a Polish garrison stationed at Westerplatte, and that the war concluded aboard the battleship USS Missouri, when Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu signed the Instrument of Surrender on September 2, 1945, meaning that the battleship had a key role in both the very beginning and the very end of the Second World War. After World War II, many navies continued utilizing their remaining battleships to patrol the world's oceans. However, battleships would eventually be phased out and would only play minor roles in future conflicts. The only battleship commissioned after World War II was the HMS Vanguard, and although several nations, including the United States, had battleships in the works, they were scrapped for reasons that we'll come to very soon. The remaining battleships that no longer had a purpose in the post-World War era were used in a variety of ways. The USS Arkansas and Nagato were both destroyed during nuclear weapons testing during Operation Crossroads in 1946. Both battleships were able to withstand the airburst of a nuclear bomb, but sunk when exposed to an underwater nuclear explosion. Many other battleships were scrapped for parts as navies shifted toward different types of vessels. The use of battleships in combat didn't end there, though. The United States would recommission 4 Iowa-class battleships: the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, and the Wisconsin in 1951, as the Korean War erupted in Asia. Their 16-inch guns continued to be highly effective at bombarding targets onshore from a distance. The guns had a range of about 20 miles and could hit their intended targets with relative accuracy. After the Korean War, the battleships would once again be decommissioned, but the New Jersey would see battle again during the Vietnam War, firing around 6,000 rounds of 16-inch shells and over 14,000 rounds of 5-inch shells while deployed. Interestingly, this was approximately 7 times more ordnance than the vessel fired in all of World War II. By the 1980s, the United States was the only country with operational battleships. However, they had been slightly modified and equipped with cruise missiles. During this time, Navy Secretary John F. Lehman launched a program to build a 600-ship navy to combat the ever-present Soviet threat. In fact, when the U.S. found out that the Soviet Union was commissioning a new type of nuclear-powered guided missile battlecruiser called the Kirov class, all 4 American battleships were recommissioned. They acted as support ships and carrier groups, and even led their own battle groups. The Iowa-class battleships now carried Tomahawk TLAM missiles. During the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s, the New Jersey bombarded the coast throughout Operation Blue Bat. The Missouri and Wisconsin also both fired shells and missiles at land targets during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. After Desert Storm came to an end, the Wisconsin and Missouri would both be decommissioned, marking the last time a battleship would be used in a naval mission. Now all 4 Iowa-class battleships are museums. The Missouri is in Honolulu, Hawaii, the Iowa in Los Angeles, California, the New Jersey is in Camden, New Jersey, and the Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia. In 2006, the battleship was finally removed from the U.S. Naval Vessel Register, and in 2014, no battleships were listed in U.S. Navy Reserve. Now, let's take a look at the main reasons why battleships ended up being obsolete and eventually decommissioned following World War II. The first has already been touched upon and has to do with a shift in technology. Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway solidified the aircraft carrier as the dominant vessel in maritime warfare. Major naval conflicts were no longer being fought ship to ship, but from air to sea as well. The aircraft launched from carriers could travel vast distances, meaning that the battleships would never see the vessels from which the attack was coming, and thus could not hope to fire their guns at them. With the shifting of naval warfare and the advancement of several other technologies, battleships just didn't make sense in the grand scheme of things. On top of the shift in naval tactics, there were two other main reasons why battleships and navies across the world were decommissioned and scrapped for parts following World War II. The first had to do with the number of sailors required to operate the floating fortress, and the second had to do with the technological advances being made in warfare in general. Building a battleship is expensive. It's estimated that each Iowa-class battleship cost the United States approximately $100 million to build, which is around $1.65 billion in today's money. However, it actually was the sailors on board that made battleships one of the costliest vessels to operate. As the years progressed and the world was no longer at war, many countries, including the US, looked for ways to reduce costs within their militaries. Some countries decreased the amount of money allocated to defense spending, while others decommissioned or sold large numbers of ships, planes, and vehicles. However, when it came to cutting naval costs, the best way to do so was to have fewer sailors operating the ships. Therefore, over the years, the United States has built different types of ships to reduce crew size while still retaining the firepower necessary to achieve mission goals. The U.S. battleship New Jersey required a crew of close to 2,000 sailors. By comparison, a typical cruiser operates with somewhere between 300 and 400 men, with destroyers having a crew complement slightly lower. This means that the crew of a battleship can be up to 5 times higher than other large naval vessels. Aircraft carriers have crews of around 5,000, but this is because they're the equivalent of floating cities. They also need to carry pilots and mechanics aboard to operate and maintain the planes. So for the limited operational capabilities of a battleship, the number of crew needed to operate the vessel just doesn't make sense, especially when you bring money into the equation. This is the main reason why the US continuously decommissioned their battleships after each conflict they partook in. To continue using them in naval fleets was just too expensive due to the huge complement of crew needed to keep the ships running. The second major factor that led to the retirement of battleships was because their main guns fired unguided ammunition. The shells fired from the turrets on a battleship can cause massive damage to targets on land. However, once a shell is fired, there's no way to adjust its course. Even if the gunner has the target lined up perfectly, there are a lot of variables that can influence the shell's trajectory while in flight. To put this in perspective, when a skilled gunner sighted an enemy ship from 9 miles away, they had only around a 32% chance of hitting their mark. This was in World War II, and sighting systems have advanced greatly since then, but even still, during non-combat tests of the 1980s and 90s, upgraded battleships could only be expected to land shells somewhere in a 150-yard radius around their intended target. If the US military needed to hit something precisely, the guns of a battleship were not the way to go. As militaries and other projectile weapons became more accurate, militaries were expected to minimize collateral damage. Unfortunately for battleships, this was not possible in the same way it was for destroyers or cruisers that employed missiles that could detonate within feet of their intended targets. The inability to precisely strike targets, along with the high cost to man and operate battleships, were two very compelling reasons that led the U.S. Navy to decommission and eventually completely retire battleships from their fleets. That being said, these aren't the only reasons battleships no longer patrol the waters of Earth's oceans. In a couple of decades, the battleships of World War II will have been around for a century. The parts required to maintain them are no longer made. A whole new group of sailors would also need to be trained to operate the vessels, and the maintenance to keep those old naval relics going would be more costly than ever. Therefore, it's highly unlikely that these once state-of-the-art wartime vessels will ever sail the seas again. Instead, they'll remain floating monuments for civilians to enjoy and learn about the legacy of the age of battleships. Now watch The Evolution of an Aircraft Carrier, or check out Kursk Submarine Disaster, Russian Navy's biggest mistake.